Hi, this is Jack Lawrence, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who plays bluegrass music.
Hey, welcome back to Bluegrass Jam Along. This is part of 2 of the Doc Watson 100th birthday special episode. If you haven't downloaded part 1, go back and check that out, because there's some really cool conversations in there with people like T. Michael Coleman and Jack Lawrence. So do go and check that out. But this is part 2, and this is a bit more focused on Doc's influence on other players, and people who've taken his music further on, people who've listened to it and loved it. Some of them knew Doc, some worked with Doc. Some were just fans of Doc. But yeah, it's a really cool selection of people you've got coming up here. First, you're going to hear from Mike Marshall. Then you're going to hear from banjo legend Tony Trischka, Laurie Lewis, Bryan Sutton, Bob Minner, Scott Nygaard, Chris Eldridge, Jake Eddy, Sid Griffin, Tim O'Brien, and Ketch Secor from Old Crow Medicine Show. That we're going to kick off. One of the common themes of having these conversations has been about seeing Doc at festivals, and that being people's introduction to him. And there's no better version of that story than Mike Marshall. So we're going to kick off this episode with a chat with mandolin player Mike Marshall, who saw Doc at a festival when he was young, and it changed the course of his life. Here's Mike Marshall.
Yeah, it was the first festival I ever went to, and it was in Livonia, Georgia, northern Georgia. They had this festival it was a 2-weekend festival. Plus, during the week was workshops. And when I think back on those days, I realized that I was being thrust into the center of what would become the sort of history of this music, in terms of, folks like Ricky Skaggs was in the Stanley Brothers, and Marty Stewart was playing with Lester Flatt, and J.D. Crowe and the New South were there with Jerry and Tony, and Country Gentlemen, Seldom Seen, the Lewis family, just everybody, Mac Wiseman. But seeing Doc and Merle, they were just a duo at that point. I don't think they had T. Michael with them. It was just mind-blowing, to be in the presence of that amount of, I guess you would say, history of American music, really. He really kind of defined the whole thing to many of us, in terms of being so aware of where this music came from in a really broad sense. I suppose being blind in those days, that was, to become a musician was definitely an option. And it provided you with, of course, unbelievable ears, but also time. I think of Doc as this researcher, when you think of all the tunes he turned us on to, and then you follow the trail of where those tunes came from. And he turned a whole generation onto all this black music and blues and early country and swing and bluegrass and on it goes. Just a walking library of all of that stuff. And so it's just pointed the direction for our whole generation, really. The Will the Circle Be Unbroken record had just come out. And so many of us were discovering him for the first time, and then to see him live and just the way that he communicated with his bandmates, not being able to make eye contact in that way that you would as a seeing person. His voice was just so reassuring and so clear, how he could direct a jam session sitting at the guitar. And just by talking to the musicians in that way that he did, so beautiful. Let's hear you, Sammy. You take one, or whatever it would be to pass it on to someone. Those kind of communication skills were just so enormous. Not to mention his friendly demeanor on stage and how he could just dissolve any of the differences that the society of bluegrass might have had around race or the hippies were showing up at the festivals at that time, and so you had this little bit of tension between the long-haired folks and the real Southerners who were the real keepers of this music. Here was Doc, who had a foot in each camp and just made it okay for everyone. Had this way about himself. And not, of course, we're not even touching on the musicality and the ungodly guitar chops and precision and sense of time and feel. I mean, we go down that rabbit hole. We're here for hours.
That's a really interesting point about sort of bringing the different factions together, because that point in the 60s when Doc really sort of hit the national consciousness, it almost was the college kids and the hippies that were driving a lot of that, sort of that brought the bluegrass and the folk music and the old time back into people's ears.
Yeah, it was one of those moments. I think Deliverance, the movie, had just come out. And as we know, the same way that Oh Brother, Where Art Thou had that kind of profound effect on the urban centers discovering roots music. Daryl Anger has this theory that it comes around like the cicadas every 7 years. You know, America realizes that it has a traditional music, and it makes its way up into the mainstream. So that was happening, and then the Will the Circle Be Unbroken explosion of that record sort of launched Doc into that younger generation of urban kids, and he had a great sense. I don't know all the details of who his agents and managers were at that time, but they were helping him, play college campuses, and the folk boom had already happened, and he was certainly part of that early on. And so he just kind of drove it. Such a delightful performer and engaging, and really knew how to work a crowd like that. And so, to just think about him traveling on the road as much as he did, it's unbelievable. Staying in all those hotels, getting on and off those planes, buses. You might know more than I do, but I had heard that he always stayed in a Holiday Inn, a certain model of Holiday Inn, because he knew the layout of how it was designed, and he could find his room easily.
Yeah, it must make such a difference if you sort of know what you're walking into.
Yeah, touring as a blind musician. I mean, can you imagine? I think we all forget that, because he had this magical way of making his blindness just disappear for all of us. We would just forget because we're so engaged in the music. But I know how hard it is to tour and keep yourself healthy and find stuff to eat. And man, I'm sure Merle helped a lot, but he wasn't there for a lot of it. And even when he was there, still had separate rooms, and he had to find his way around. And it's phenomenal to think about the strength it took.
And what did sort of seeing Doc at that festival sort of do for you personally in terms of your musical journey? How did that affect you and where you wanted to go?
Well, it was the defining moment for me in my life, really, being at that festival and seeing all of those musicians, of course, but Doc was, in many ways, center of it. The teacher I had at the time, Jim Hillegas, I believe he turned me on to Doc earlier. He might have even showed me Deep River Blues before we went there. And so to see him live and be in that environment, it just sort of pointed the way for me musically. It was no question that this was what I wanted to do. Freaked my parents out. You're not going to go to college? Well, Ma, thinking about this music thing. We had a teenage bluegrass band at the time, the Sunshine Bluegrass Boys. We had the banjo player's parents had a Winnebago with our name painted on the side, and we had the matching polyester double knit suits. So we fit right into that culture. But I was always interested in the more progressive things that were happening at the time, and so Doc just just sort of pointed the way. Is the best way I could say it. It's like this is what you'll want to do. This would be a great community to be a part of, and to study this music the way Doc had, to be able to look back as far as he did, and then incorporate that somehow into finding your own voice. That was also a big part of what he represented, and I think for a lot of us, because he didn't have that high lonesome sound, that so many bluegrass pickers had at the time. That was folks were striving for, and he, like I said earlier, he had such a broad appreciation for all kinds of music, whether it was Sweet Georgia Brown or a country song or a blues thing, or a fiddle tune. Being able to rip through all these fiddle tunes. redefining how a guitar could be played must have put a light bulb in my head that to be a musician is to create something unique, something original, and to push at the boundaries of what people thought the instrument was capable of the generation before. He represented that as a guitarist. And so I more gravitated towards the mandolin, but certainly was thinking in those terms of like, gee, all right, the previous generation has done X with this instrument. Is it possible to do Y and Z?
Yeah, and that's great. It's that idea of you are just a collection of all the things you bring together and then what you add to it as a unique sort of artist in whatever way you are, because that's the point, really, isn't it?
I would say, but of course we all have our heroes when we're young, and so it seems to be a collection of all of that. I tell my mandolin students, well, I learned every Sam Bush solo I could get my hands on, especially the ones on Doc's records. Little Georgia Rose, and I forget the names of all of them, but Sam just took incredible solos on all those records. And She's My Curly-Headed Baby, I think. And so I learned all that stuff in as much detail as I could. But in the end, finding my own voice was the goal. And I suppose I remember a conscious moment where I said, well, I'm going to have to play something else besides Sam Bush licks now, starting now. And that was the moment probably when my own voice started to appear. First kind of agreeing with myself. That, I remember a lot of interviews with people who played with Miles after John Coltrane or after Wayne Shorter, and they had the same conversations. Miles did not want them playing the stuff that the previous cats had played, so they were kind of forced to go exploring. There must be another way, so you got to find your own voice. And incredible that Doc obviously had that sense in his own self early on, clearly. It's like, what did Shakespeare read?
Yeah, and that sort of just that the place that he grew up was rich with music. Then in an age where we weren't so connected, and so he absorbed what was around him.
Well,
and then added to that, I guess.
That's got to have been a big part of it. Was just the community of traditional music in that part of the country is just so fiercely strong, and they're just holding it together. And but again, raising a family as a blind man and going to all those jam sessions, how did he fit it all in? I loved reading the book, by the way, that fellow wrote on Doc, and learning about his early life, going to all the sessions and hanging out with those musicians. Yes, it's interesting to be a traditional artist and yet be somebody who pushes at the future of where the music could go. You've got to kind of have one foot reaching back and an arm reaching ahead somehow. And Doc represented that.
Next up, we've got banjo legend Tony Trischka, who talks about hearing Doc at Newport Folk Festival in the 60s, which is, I think, for a lot of people when Doc sort of hit their consciousness. So here comes Tony Trischka.
That's the first time I even heard about Doc Watson. I think there was a Folkways record, the Watson family, that might have been out before that, but I was unaware of it. And Doc Watson was playing with a group with Fred Price, Clint Howard, and Clarence Ashley, who recorded The Cuckoo back in 1928 or something like that. This wonderful, wonderful banjo player. And there's some recordings of them from that festival, and I remember that. But mostly I remember Doc performing solo and doing things like Deep River Blues and Doc's guitar, which later became known as Tickling the Strings, and of course, Black Mountain Rag. Those are the tunes that stuck out for me. And I got his first album. I think his first album might have come out that year. It's just this black and white photo, very plain, beautiful cover. And I learned to play those on the guitar as close as I could get to the way he did it anyway. And it was just kind of his coronation. Okay, now here's this amazing artist from Deep Gap, North Carolina, is now out on his own. Even though he was playing with his group, he also did his solo thing as well. And it was just remarkable. And even though we'd heard, or some people had heard of Don Reno doing country boy rock and roll in the late 50s, maybe, some great flat picking guitar, and George Shuffler doing also some really nice flat picking, a lot of cross picking with the Stanley Brothers. Unless you were fairly deep into bluegrass, you wouldn't be aware of that. And here's Doc Watson on the stage of the Newport Folk Festival, where Bob Dylan was also discovered to be too strong a word, but where he really hit it with everyone up on stage singing Blowin' in the Wind. So it's interesting that they both sort of hit at the same time in a big way like that. And then in 1964, I was at the 64 Newport Folk Festival as well and saw a workshop with Doc and Clarence White, perhaps the passing of the baton, something like that. And Clarence was there with the Kentucky Colonels. And for a flat picking enthusiast, it doesn't get better than that. I also remember, this is an aside, not having to do with Doc, but I remember right after that festival, Clarence White being behind the workshop stage and this banjo player, Roger Sprung, probably the first New Yorker to play bluegrass banjo in Washington Square in the 50s. And Roger Sprung had a group called the Progressive Bluegrassers, and he was doing things different than bluegrass, including Sousa marches. And he was trying to show Clarence the Stars and Stripes Forever. John Philip Sousa marched with 1,000 chords and was getting frustrated because Clarence wasn't picking up the chords right away. Like, it's Clarence White. He just got off the stage with Doc Watson. Give him a break. Jeez. So
cool. That was Tony Trischka. My next guest is singer-songwriter Laurie Lewis, who, again, saw Doc play at a festival initially. But yeah, she's going to talk about sort of the influence Doc had on her and how hearing Doc was just such a special thing for her. So here is singer-songwriter Laurie Lewis.
I kind of got bitten by the folk music buzz and bug in the 1960s. I was a teenager, maybe 14, when I decided I wanted to play guitar. And my brother's piano teacher's son was a few years older than me. And I think he was a college student, and he was totally into Doc Watson. And he would come over and I think he first played a Doc Watson record for me. And then I just went out and bought them and followed him. And I went down to the Berkeley Folk Festival, which was a huge event every year, and Doc would be there. And I just was totally smitten by his playing, which is beautiful, and his singing, which is so natural and almost it's conversational, and also the kind of range of material he did, what he would choose to do. I really loved the songs. And then on top of that is just this mastery, instrumental mastery, which was so beautiful to watch, like kind of up close. You know, these are fairly small audiences. And I remember as a kid walking into Lundberg's guitar store in Berkeley one day, and there was this guy with his back to me playing this banjo, gold-plated banjo, which I eventually realized was a good old Gibson master tone, probably a pre-war master tone or something. And I was just, it sounded so beautiful what he was playing just by himself. And then he got to the end of it and started talking, and it was Doc Watson. And I was like less than 6 feet from him because it was a tiny store. And that just kind of, it thrilled me. And to be influenced by his music and then actually meet him and understand what a kind, I don't know, just a good soul he was. He would always tell me when I saw him at the at Merlefest a number of years. I played there, and he would. Well, first of all, it was very, very scary for me because I'm kind of shy, and to talk to a blind person, you have to instigate the conversation. You have to say, "Hey, this is Laurie Lewis, and I'm here," you know, and that part was like a huge wall to get over for me. But when I finally did, he was just so sweet, and he's told me how Rosalie, his wife, just loved to watch the home place, and they listened to it all the time. And later, when we Tom Rosen and I sang a song, "Teardrops Falling in the Snow," a Molly O'Day song, and we were playing it at a festival, a bluegrass festival in Dahlonega, Georgia. And I happened to look back at the back of the stage while we were doing that song. And Doc was sitting by himself in a chair right behind the wings where the audience couldn't see him, but I could see him. And then there were tears streaming down his face. It was like, very gratifying for me to be recognized and appreciated by somebody like Doc, because he was such a huge influence on me.
Yeah, and I've heard like just 2 or 3 stories about Doc that people just share as part of this podcast that are really intimate, little quiet moments that just have clearly like touched people, and just the joy with which people talk about Doc. And like, obviously I never met Doc. I'm relatively new to the world of sort of folk and bluegrass music, but just to hear the way people speak about him is like a joyous thing. And it's almost like the music is incredible in its own right, but just the way people speak about the man as well. I mean, you were talking earlier on about like the breadth of material, but also the directness of the way he delivered it. And I think that probably just is the man coming through the music, because for most musicians, I think it's easy to let something get in between who we are and what we express. And if you can get out of the way of that, that's sort of the most beautiful thing there is in music sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's true. I just heard a podcast, The Hidden Brain, which I listen to sometimes. And it was about how people are attracted to people who approach what they do with purpose, like living a purposeful life. And I really feel like that's the sort of thing with Doc was one of the things. And maybe his blindness was an aid in him for communicating to an audience, because you don't have he's not looking anywhere. You know, you just are seeing this person like wrapped up in what he's doing, and it's so attractive. It's and I think, you know, if you were sighted, you'd certainly have the same feeling. But I was thinking about that because I was thinking about Doc, and yeah, he had that real sense of purpose in putting his music across. That's just undeniable. You're just attracted to it.
And that sort of different versions of people expressing that, and also like everybody I think I've spoken to has spoken about the range of music, and like coming to it, I hear it all as in my head, because it all sounds so much like Doc. I hear it as all being like one genre of music, but obviously it's not. It doesn't. But it just all comes through this funnel that makes it of the same place.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder about that with Doc, because apparently from the things I've heard or something, he was really into more, dance hall electric music and the powers that be. Maybe it was Ralph Rinsler or whoever got him in front of the folk audiences. Kind of said, "Well, you got to, do this traditional stuff. That's what people want to hear." And I wonder if left completely to his own devices and not having to make a living, what he would have gravitated towards. And I suppose it would be the range of materials he did later in his life, with his bands and stuff. He was all over the place.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Is that he started out playing guitar for people to dance to. And when you're doing that, pretty quickly if it's not working. So to be able to read an audience, either an audience in the room with you or an audience just in general, and give them a bit of what they want, and yet remain utterly true to what you believe in and want to deliver. It's like, that's quite a balancing act.
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy to give an audience what you think they want and get it wrong.
Yes. I would say that's true. And I don't think he ever did that. I think he always gave the audience what they wanted. And
I wonder, with such a strong, musical personality and so kind of engaging, as you say, whether, he could have taken us anywhere, because it's him inviting you to go there.
Exactly.
And you go, well, if, I believe in what you do. I trust this entirely. So if you're going over there, let's go see what's over there.
Yeah. It's like following the Beatles. I mean, through all their peregrinations, you could do the same thing with Doc if he had chosen to lead you. Wherever he led you, I would have followed.
Yeah.
Although I have to say that for me, maybe it's because it was the first stuff I heard, but I love the old timey traditional stuff, that old time music at Clarence Ashley's, those albums. I just love everything about his playing and singing on those things, and his early albums, where he plays banjo and guitar and solo stuff.
Do you think maybe geography has a part in that, because Doc grew up where that music came from, and his family knew a couple of the characters in some of those songs? They were of where he was. They were sort of living history. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, he's a link for sure. A link to the incredible, wonderful music of the Appalachians.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's tricky to separate a person from a place. It's like some music is just sort of, you can't really pin it down anywhere. It just is music. But Doc's music feels so much like it is of a time and of a place, and yet timeless and placeless at the same time.
Yeah. I met a man in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I cannot remember his name right now, but he was a good friend of Doc's, and he told me a story about driving. He hadn't seen Doc in a really long time, I think years, and just drove out to visit him, and drove up to the house, and Doc was outside planing. A cellar door wasn't fitting right, and he was working on it, and had it up on the sawhorses, planing an edge of it. And he drove up, and Doc turned around and said his name. He said, "Well, hello there, so-and-so. I hear you're still driving that, whatever kind of car it was." He says, "It's missing on the fourth cylinder." It's like not even a brake. And I don't know. I don't know enough of that story for it to go anywhere, but I love that image. It just, he knew who it was. His ears were so attuned. I have to tell you, one of the saddest things I ever heard was somebody asked Doc what he'd noticed, what changes he'd noticed over his life. And he said, the birds. He said, they don't sing like they used to. There's not as many, and they just aren't there anymore like they used to be. And for somebody living out there in the, in a rural America and really noticing that, I mean, I think, wow, my backyard's full of birds, but he really heard that change in his lifetime.
Some of the people on this episode I've spoken to before, and some were new to me, and I'd never spoken to Laurie before, and that was a real treat. I really enjoyed our conversation. But next up is somebody who I have spoken to on the podcast before, and it's Bryan Sutton. And I probably don't need to introduce you to Bryan. He is one of the legends of bluegrass of our time, and I had a great chat with Bryan about the sort of influence Doc had on him as a guitarist, as a musician, and just, in general as a sort of touchstone for him, for how he approaches music. So here is Bryan Sutton.
When I think about sort of foundations of my connection to the guitar, and kind of, the way those sort of foundational figures in your life, musically or otherwise, tend to kind of just be in your brain all the time, like your parents. My musical foundation, again, is my biological dad and the experiences that I had with him in our musical community. But Doc Watson is the next sort of big figure. I've often said that it's either my dad and Doc, my dad and Doc Watson are kind of the real true foundations of kind of how I connect with the instrument and how I feel that, knowing where I come from sort of feeling. And even before I ever got to know him or see him live, there was just this, I don't know if it was a North Carolina thing or just knowing that what I heard him present on records felt so familiar and so, so much like most of what I was playing on a regular basis around home. So, again, there was just this immediate kind of connection. It didn't feel like I had to go sort of acclimate to what he was doing. He was sort of speaking our own language, that sort of mountain music language. And also in a way too, that again, sort of spoke to, a lot of my own experience with music as a kid, just because again, what I noticed about Doc personally is his ability to play very traditional things very simplistically, but also play things that had more either, jazz chords or adopt a pop tune or a swing song or something like that. And that's a lot of what we were doing as well around Asheville when I was a kid. Jam sessions would be bluegrass and fiddle tunes, but we'd also play Sweet Georgia Brown and Lady Be Good and stuff like that. And I was encouraged as a kid guitar player to jump in and take solos and learn those chords and things. And again, to have this figure of Doc Watson and by extension, Merle and Jack Lawrence as well. Once I got to start seeing them live, it was just great sort of energy and added just motivation for me to continue to kind of grow and learn on the instrument. And in fact, Doc was the first, as far as like a national music figure that I saw on stage, Doc Watson was the first. He was my first concert. And that was Doc and Merle and T. Michael. And then a few years later, I would see them on occasion at our this big Fiddlers Convention Festival in Union Grove, North Carolina, with Doc and Jack and Merle and T. Michael, and then Doc and Jack and T. Michael, and then just Doc and Jack. But I would record those shows and then go back to the campsite and learn as much as I could from what I'd just heard. So, I guess all that to say, there was just a lot of years of me growing again from the sort of the nuclear musical concept of Dad and our community, and Doc just sort of provided all this great, like, here's where it can go, kid, kind of information, and I was just soaking it up and again playing along to things and learning all the records and things like that. So it was, it's to try to state what it is personally to me beyond just kind of, I love his playing and love his music. It really his output and again the people that surrounded him on stage and on the records really provided me with a sense of a bigger kind of potential community, as I would, start thinking about professional ideals and things like that. It can be done. And these guys are doing it, and I want to be part of it. So that's when I say, again, to my deep foundations of experience with the guitar, personally, professionally, all this stuff, there's such a connection to Doc from such an early age, along with these other people that I was, more physically around as a kid. That's a lot.
Yeah. And I've heard you talk before about sort of Doc being the main influence for you in terms of playing fiddle tunes on guitar, sort of providing the blueprint for how you hear those things.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times what I've done, because, just for me as a guitar player, there's Doc, and there's also Norman Blake and Tony Rice and all these great sort of, the foundations that a lot of us share. And so what I've done is just sort of like, what truly is the essence that I've always found so appealing about any one of these people. But to speak to Doc specifically, it's just this clarity. It's a certain kind of rhythmic bounce in his playing, but certainly kind of like this very clear sort of water droplet kind of sound, and very decisive too. And even as a singer and rhythm player, it's just very, very kind of clear, very musical. Not mechanical, certainly, but just, you can hear every word that he ever said. There was never, listening to him sing where you wondered what the lyric was, and this kind of very comfortable clarity that I noticed in Doc that I try to feel that, I'm infusing somehow in my own playing.
And it feels like a kind of clarity of intent as well. It feels like you're hearing something direct from like a wellspring of something really real. Like the music can do all sorts of things, but Doc's music in all forms I've heard, it feels just so direct and so pure.
Yeah, and I think, in any kind of art form, when you get somebody like that can completely make something their own, and again, they're doing it so naturally. It's not like it's some conscious thought about how can I take these different sort of elements and, be some sort of musical chemist and like consciously kind of create something. It was completely natural for him because of his experience and hearing his mother play the banjo and things like that, and growing up in a musical community as well. And it was just, again, just a wonderful kind of organic perfection, if you will, of just him being so direct and clear and kind of unaffected by a lot of the things that sort of hold other folks back, I would say. I mean, I'm speaking for him now, and I shouldn't do that, but just at least in the interpretation of it, it feels like that he had a real clear sense of what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it, and how he would portray himself on stage, and again, but just felt very natural and honest for him. And I think that's, as a lesson to any of us that try to do something similar, I think that's where it is just, that the true honesty and not trying to make it something that it's not, just to appeal to masses. He had probably opportunities back in the early 60s where, in the folk boom to maybe, change one thing or another, but that was why it was so good, because it was so real feeling for everybody, because it was truly honest and real. And his shows always felt like, and he would say this, this is just us on the front porch playing. That's truly what it was.
And I guess when the sort of folk boom happened, there were groups around that were offering a more polished, kind of concert-friendly version of some of those songs for like a mass audience. And to hear Doc do them after hearing those must have felt like, the cobwebs have been blown away a little bit.
Yeah, you hear a lot of that, the real sort of vanilla, homogenized kind of folky sound, and then you hear Doc Watson and yeah, you just sort of, you hear where all that comes from. You can have an appreciation for one or the other, but when you hear the source, it's an undeniable kind of experience.
We heard Doc talk about the song Tom Dooley and his family actually having a connection to his grandmother had a connection to that family, and so it wasn't just a story out of a songbook for Doc. It was, and it talks to what you were saying earlier about you felt maybe a connection to Doc because of geography. It felt like it's easy for me to romanticize from this side of the pond and decades later, but it feels like there's something there, an authenticity.
Yeah, truly. There's an interesting book you ought to read sometime called Unprepared to Die. And I think it's actually a British author that does a great amount of research into all these murder ballads, including Tom Dula. And yeah, it's amazing how much of that comes from like Winston-Salem over to Wilkes County and Boone. And that's Doc's territory. But, whether it's, a lot of the sort of American traditional music that obviously came from somewhere, a lot of those tunes were either melodically adapted from some older thing. And, but I think, the geography of just the mountains is something a lot of us have talked about, where it's, it was fairly isolated for a lot of years. And I think, by the time Doc was out and about and touring and things like that, he'd already been well influenced by folks that had never left that area, and their, the whole worldview was, a 25-mile radius maybe. And it's just interesting to think about how the, music had such an opportunity to crystallize and just, be what it is for us today that go back and enjoy it.
Yeah. The world's changed a lot in the sort of 100 years since Doc was born, and you
right.
gain some things and you lose some things.
Sure. It's interesting. I always try to have the conversation with folks of what's the right way a fiddle tune should be played. And, and even 100 years ago, things were still evolving and from where, as far as what the original melody of Soldier's Joy or St. Anne's Reel or Salt Creek or whatever it might have been that Doc would have played. And, and again, Doc would still kind of adapt and change certain things and kind of make it his own and be part of that evolution. I think that's, again, to his honest kind of clear influence, just like Bill Monroe and these people that would kind of come along at a very pivotal point in the 20th century with American music, at least, and record and be sort of be a source in and of themselves. But yet my point here is that, or trying to make a point, is that, we're continuing to be kind of in this, continued evolution of this kind of music and how it's folk music essentially, and people evolve and adapt it and change it and figure out ways either through limitations or whatever to make it work for them. And I think, again, Doc just kind of had his natural spot in that evolution before him, during him, and then now after him, how things continue to evolve. But that's always also the balance of kind of staying true to what feels authentic and like the legitimate thing, or what is the real melody. But how can any of us find ourselves in that too as artists? Yeah.
And you released the record, sort of a tribute record to Doc with David Holt and T. Michael Coleman. It's probably a decade or so ago now, was it?
Maybe a little more, but yeah.
Yeah, and that's, it feels like Doc has a way of still encouraging people now to carry on what he was doing and to celebrate it and try. It's the spirit of Doc seems to be something that continues. That sort of, it's not a fiercely traditional, you can only do it this way approach. The whole traditional plus idea was very open, but it's at the same time very down to earth.
Yeah, that's a tricky balance, and I think that's what makes it appealing for a lot of people, because you can sort of find your way in it. And I think the folks that really decide to kind of learn and study these records, or like the folks that would have moved. There's a lot of folks that I grew up around that actually moved to Western North Carolina to be around more of that sort of source of fiddle music, and kind of immerse themselves in it the way the Beatles went to India or something like that to kind of really get an experience. But like with the balance of how much tradition that you're going to define success as, rendering or reproducing versus, okay, here's me influenced by this, and this is going to come through my own personal, filters or whatever. And I think, again, for what folk music is, that is the balance, is how you hear that person, but also hear that connection to, whatever the source is. And again, Doc had his way to do it that was just incredibly influential and powerful. And again, I think that's
what he would search for is again, not ways to fundamentally change it, but just make it feel right for him and the folks that he was playing with. And the thing for me that I always notice is just this energy in it. Again, there's this essence of clarity and that we talk about, but just this fun kind of factor too. It was enjoyable. There was, I guess the emotional aspect, whether it was again a sad kind of or more contemplative kind of moment, or just raucous and fun. Just that really giving into what the tune could be. I think about, versions of him doing, either Way Downtown or Mama Don't Allow, but then like stuff like Shady Grove or, Your Lone Journey that were just incredibly, just deep and mellow. And so it could be all these different things. And I think the point there is just the emotional connection that comes out in the music, where it's not just rendering the songs. A lot of times super traditionalists, really want to kind of just toe the line and check all the right boxes. And I think you can do that, and through like finding like a true emotional connection to what that is, it turns into more of your own thing. And I think, again, that's what Doc did, and certainly a lesson for me as I continue to try to play songs that he did. Like there's one, in the Way Downtown, the third verse is "Wish I was down at Sweet Sally's house." I'll say Sweet Loretta's house, because that's my wife's name. So I mean, just little things to to big things like that. To just personalize it and make it feel real for each of us. That is the tricky balance.
And I think people can smell it a mile off. It's like some of the more sentimental songs, or something a bit more sort of poppy, like Tennessee Stud, where he's doing the little hoof beats on top of the guitar. That could appear to be really sort of corny, but it's just delivered as this is just part of what. And like when Billy Strings covers that song now, he does the little hoof beats on top of the guitar, and it could come across as being a bit trite, but it comes across as being perfectly real, because he believes it and he means it, and he's doing it sincerely. And I think that's the thing that people can smell if it's not there.
Yeah, I like to think that, in this era of just extremely produced music and kind of fast food, pop tastes and things like this, that there is still some essence of the greater the greater population that can kind of notice the difference between something that's really contrived and something that's not. And again, I agree with you that no matter how potentially sort of showy Doc would get with one thing or another, it just felt like, okay, this is what we should do here. This, it had purpose. It had, it helped either tell the story or connect you somehow emotionally to what was going on. And again, most of the song, like folks that aren't even flat pickers that I sit around and we gush about Doc over one thing or another. It's like songwriters just love the way he interpreted a lyric and things like that. And just, again, there's just so many layers of that sincerity to appreciate about him.
Cool. Always a joy to talk to Bryan. Following on from a point Bryan made about the singing is another quick bit here from Tony Trischka. We had a chat and he talked a bit about Doc as a singer, so I thought I'd just pop that in here because it feels relevant. So here comes Tony Trischka again.
We always think of what an amazing guitar player he was, as I always did. And then there was some point many years after first hearing him that I started listening to his singing, and I went, wow, he's an amazing singer. His phrasing, the way he phrases, is just incredible. He just sounds, it's so sophisticated. It's, because you can hear his singing. It's just sort of like, I liken it to hearing Bill Monroe's mandolin playing. You listen to it, and it's Bill, and it's great, and it's funky, and it's soulful, and all this. But when you slow it down to half speed, he's doing his note choices are amazing. There's all this really subtle stuff that you miss unless you're really listening carefully or slow it down to half speed. And I think the same thing with Doc singing. Oh, it's Doc singing. It's this warm baritone, and it's Doc. But when you really listen carefully and listen to how he's phrasing it, it's really special. He was a great singer, I think. And then the only other thing is that there's a very early recording, maybe from 1962, where he's playing electric guitar. I don't know if you've heard any of that. Perhaps you have, yeah.
Yeah, I heard that he sort of started as an electric player and was sort of convinced to sort of play more acoustically to get further on the folk scene, I guess.
Yeah, I think Ralph Rinsler might have had something to do with that, as I understand it. Okay, this is great, sound wonderful, but yeah, exactly what you said. Play acoustic guitar and you'll have a whole world open up to you.
It's fascinating what you were saying about the singing, because I remember, I think it's on one of the early records, and I can't remember exactly which one, but hearing him talk about suffering, and it's completely a cappella. And I'd heard, Ricky Skaggs sing it with, Tony Rice, and I've heard that song before, but you hear just Doc's voice, and you hear the voice and the sound of a room, and just I think maybe it goes to your point about not noticing how good it is sometimes. It's just because it doesn't sound like he's trying. Like we got so used to singing that shows you how good it is in the last few decades. People are at pains for you to hear what a great singer they are, and this is just sort of music coming out of somebody. And obviously, it's not effortless, but it just feels so fully formed and complete. Yeah,
I think that's a great way to put it. It's not like he took voice lessons, or it just flowed out of him like water. Just a very natural thing for him. Maybe it was easy for him, but that's just what was easy for him is remarkable.
Cool. Next up is another guitarist who's incredibly influenced by Doc. It's Bob Minner, and his sort of day gig has been the guitarist for Tim McGraw. I'm sure a lot of you know. Bob's also an awesome flat picker, and just a fascinating character. He recently released a tribute record to Norman Blake called From Sulphur Springs to Rising Fawn. If you don't know, you should go and check out. He's a huge Norman fan, but he's also a huge Doc fan. And I had a great chat with Bob about Doc.
I think what made Doc interesting too is he grew up in this environment of old time music, Clarence Ashley and all these other guys. So he has that root, but Doc discovered electricity at a point in his life, and was playing a Les Paul, and doing the rockabilly thing and doing electric guitar. And I don't know how much accuracy is in this, but I've always heard, was it Ralph Rinsler that, got him to go, no, I want you to maybe do this, maybe do these old tunes. And, in one way, it's typical of that younger guy who's like, no, Dad, I want to play electric guitar. I don't want to play, old time music. I want to play electric. And for some reason, Doc agreed to it, and so I think the thing with Doc is you get this, it's almost like it's a double-edged sword with him. If you know the background with his rockabilly and electric playing, you get this traditional music that he always did, but you get it with this edge on his guitar playing that kind of comes from, I would think it's a big import from his time as an electric player, and Doc plugged in for years, with acoustic guitar, which is its own thing. If you play, the world that I live in, when I play like just acoustic guitar, I approach it one way. But when I'm on the road doing my the day gig with McGraw and I'm plugged in, of course I don't, do any flat picking during the show, but if it's during a sound check or something, playing any kind of fiddle tune plugged in on an acoustic, it feels different. And I don't know how to explain that, but it doesn't feel like an acoustic guitar because it's not, it's plugged in, but Doc, for some reason, just gravitated towards that and really used it to his advantage, using a pickup on his Gallagher's. And, I don't know if it was maybe the immediacy that he got from that. Maybe it felt like an electric. I don't know. It's all speculation, but it seems when you got Doc Watson, you got traditional music, folk music, kind of like on steroids when he played guitar, because it was this edge that electric players have more than just strictly acoustic players. So just an observation. I got nothing to really base that on other than I find it interesting that, he didn't have a problem. He started with electric and didn't have a problem plugging in for many, many, many years, kind of preferred it. So just a thought.
Yeah, and you sort of there's an interesting parallel there with what Billy Strings is doing now, in that he can totally sit and play the acoustic stuff, but he's happy plugging an acoustic guitar in to carry it to a bigger audience and do different things with it. And yeah, if he plays with a plugged-in sound that doesn't sound like a straight-up acoustic, as soon as he plays a fiddle tune or he plays you an old Doc Watson song or whatever, it's totally authentic. It's just his version of totally authentic, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's what Doc had.
It does make sense. That's exactly what he had. And I think, with Billy, man, I mean, you couldn't ask for a better guy to carry the baton, with that. And the connection that's great between Billy and Doc is, here's Billy doing what he does, which is uniquely Billy Strings. And then when he does a Doc thing, I just wonder how many young guys that are like digging a Billy Strings show and digging his guitar playing, and then Billy starts talking about Doc Watson, and them going, I never heard of Doc Watson. And then they look it up. They look up Doc. So Billy he's providing an authentic conduit to bring younger players into Doc Watson, and of course, you can extrapolate that to more bluegrass or flatpick guitar as their influences grow. But, yeah, he's authentic. He's just exactly like Doc in that way. So, and I find that refreshing. And frankly, we kind of, if I may be so bold, we've just been kind of needing a guy that can bridge that gap for us and bring younger players into not only his music, but also, the more traditional artists like Doc. Same way with Molly Tuttle. She had a big spot on on one of the late night talk shows over here, the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. And I'm thinking, man, what a boost for the music, for national exposure. So yeah, Billy, he's vicious. He can play Doc. If you close your eyes, you think it's Doc. He's that good. So yeah. And Doc, his body of work, he, another record my dad had gotten early on was Doc Watson, Good Deal in Nashville, which is Nashville arrangement, Nashville musicians, session musicians. There's piano, there's other stuff on there. Doc in this environment of these Nashville musicians, which is, quite removed from what you would think Doc Watson has. And I remember that record too. That was kind of my first, I think Buddy Spiker plays fiddle on that. And, so it's a little bit more of that polished Nashville landscape, with Doc Watson. So yeah. And, but the Circle album was really kind of the big thing. And of course, I think, if you were Gallagher Guitars back in the day and Doc talking to Merle Travis, about, Gallagher Guitars, and Merle going, man, that thing just rings like a bell. You couldn't get any better promotion, for a guitar company than Doc Watson and Merle Travis talking on a record that sold untold millions.
Yeah,
so,
and that record was the thing in its day that brought a whole new bunch of people to the music as well. There's something every few years, isn't there? And that was the thing of its time that did that. And a load of people would have heard that and gone, who's this Doc Watson then?
Yeah, that kind of brought, for Doc, it brought him a broader recognition that perhaps he wouldn't have had elsewise. Maybe he would have been more relegated to the that niche of just people who like that music. But the Circle album really kind of catapulted him into a whole different level. And he didn't change because of that, you know. It would be interesting to kind of know, you know, why Doc was chosen for that record. You know, I don't know, you know. I've talked to John McEwen a little bit about the record. I've talked to Norman about it. You know, with the exception of the Dirt Band guys, the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, with the exception of them, Norman's the only musician living off that record. Everybody else has passed. Mm. But Earl, it started out as it seems that the John and the Dirt Band were friends with Earl Scruggs, which kind of would have made sense because Earl was in that Earl Scruggs review period, redefining himself with his sons. And the Dirt Band was kind of that same kind of hippie-esque, you know, thing. So it kind of makes sense that, you know, Earl was kind of, no pun intended, but instrumental in pulling those musicians together. But, you know, I have a DVD on Earl. It's footage from the 60s and 70s. It's on Earl Scruggs. It's kind of a mini documentary a little bit. And so he's going to Earl's house. He's out at Doc's house way before this video, way before the Circle album. So I kind of wonder, you know, maybe that's why they just thought maybe he says, I'm just going to bring Doc Watson in. He's a good fit for this. But that record really brought in a lot of guitar players, you know, to who Doc Watson was. And again, you know, it's like you listen to that record, like I said, Black Mountain Rag, Doc's version of it, you know, or Way Downtown. That's definitive versions, you know. Totally. So yeah, if you're going to play Black Mountain Rag, you have to play it in D, then switch to A. Well, that's just what you do. That's the way Doc did it.
Then to a fiddle player, Rag's probably played in the key of F, do you know what I mean? But everybody hears that in a different key now because it's sort of a guitar tune more than a fiddle tune to most people now.
Yeah, yeah. And Doc, you know, he was really, you know, like I said, you know, so Clarence had done that 33 fiddle tunes or acoustic guitar tunes on that cassette tape in '62. Didn't come out until 2008. So really the only one that was really bringing fiddle tunes to guitar before that, it was Doc Watson, you know, before anybody, before Dan Crary, and truth be told, even before Norman Blake. You know, I had asked Norman because Norman, he always put Fiddler's Dram and Whiskey Before Breakfast together, you know, as a medley. And so I asked Norman, I said, well, you know, did you play those tunes your whole life? Did you listen to them growing up? And he told me, he says, well, no. He says, Fiddler's Dram, he says, I learned that from Doc Watson. Wow. So he got Fiddler's Dram from Doc Watson's version, and he got Whiskey Before Breakfast from Howdy Forrester, who used to play fiddle for Acuff, because Howdy brought that into Nashville. So, but yeah, to hear Norman Blake go, no, I learned that tune from Doc Watson. That's, pretty tall cotton. So Doc was he's just kind of the archetype. I think if you had to put it into one person that, you know, let me put it to you like this. If you didn't have Doc Watson, you probably would certainly have a totally different version of what we call flat pick guitar, you know, if at all. You know, he seems to be the guy who really brought it into the forefront. And of course, with the success of the Circle album, carried it even farther and brought it to a wider audience. So, yeah. And I think you can hear his playing, and anybody that's been playing for 30, 40 years, he's certainly one of the main influences, so yeah.
That was Bob Minner. Next up, we've got Scott Nygaard, a great guitarist, also the former editor of Acoustic Guitar magazine. He's got some really interesting perspectives on Doc as a guitarist and as an influence. So here comes Scott Nygaard.
I mean, the Will the Circle Be Unbroken album was, I think a lot of people my age, that was just a huge, I know like Tim O'Brien, Laurie Lewis have talked about, like what a big influence that was. And at the time, I had sort of been fooling around with the guitar a little bit, and that came out. And it's funny because I didn't really understand guitars. I'd be listening to like stuff on the radio or like whatever, the Beatles, or I listened to the band a lot or whatever, music that was going on. And I didn't really, my parents got me a nylon string guitar when I was like 13 and a classical guitar book. And I was confused, like, why doesn't this sound like the guitar, And then at first, originally I think, okay, there's electric guitars and that. But then when I heard Doc, and then I sort of heard this idea of acoustic guitar, but I didn't understand that there were steel strings and nylon strings, right? And then when I heard Doc, it was just, that's the sound that I want. What is that? That was just immediately, that's what I want to sound like. Out of all the things that I was listening to, electric guitar players, Hendrix or Clapton or Robbie Robertson or all the stuff, I heard Doc, and, I remember things just, maybe one of the first things I learned was Tennessee Stud, because that was sort of in my, at my level at that point. I wasn't going to start playing Black Mountain Rag a little bit, but I could figure out the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, that kind of thing. And that just became, that's what I want to sound like. And then I got to hear him a couple times in the early 70s, once opening, and he was playing with Merle at that time, once opening for the Eagles in this kind of big theater where their first record had just come out. And then in a smaller venue, this club, McCabe's, in Los Angeles. And yeah, I was just, my eyes were just like, what is he doing on his hand? Just like, and I think that's, like, it's interesting to me now that, just as far as the preponderance of like tab and notation and everything, that's just, there's so much of that out there. But, I just, I figured out how to use the flat pick by watching Doc, just watching what he was doing, watching what his hand was doing. And that was just like, okay, it moves back and forth in sort of this regular fashion. And that was really it. I mean, my eyes just must have been glued. And, and I find that, that was the case for a lot of things as I was, learning music from that point on. You just learned by watching. And so he was just a huge influence, and not just playing the guitar, not just fiddling, but like not just flat picking, fiddle tunes and that sort of thing, but just the range of his repertoire was really interesting to me. And I was, I've always been interested in just all this different kind of music. So he would play old time, ballads and fiddle tunes and, raggy stuff and swing stuff and, blues, and especially with Merle and all that just seemed like, oh, that was natural that would learn how to play all of that stuff. In a sense, he wasn't really a bluegrass guitar player, and it's sort of funny too, because it went along with what you would hear on FM radio in the 70s, where you'd have these FM radio stations. Sometimes like college radio was really happening then, but also just even commercial radio. You'd have radio things where you'd have like Bob Dylan, and then, you know, Simon and Garfunkel, and then Doc Watson, and then Dan Hicks and his Hot Licks, and then, you know, all this. And it was just what was on the radio. And so it sort of fit with what I was hearing from Doc as like, yeah, this is just the thing to do, rather than sort of focus on this one particular style. And so, you know, his guitar playing had a huge influence on me, and that he was the guy who I first saw do that. And then I think it helped, soon after I started, there were a couple, guitar players in the Northwest Seattle area, who played like that, who played really, you know, alternating picking, both great players, Peter Langston and Dudley Hill. So it was kind of reinforced by seeing Doc. It's like, yeah, okay, these guys are doing the same, and I could do that. But also just, you know, I became interested in doing all these different things. You know, when I was first starting to play, I played fiddle and bluegrass banjo for a while, and, you know, sort of this sort of amalgam of American folk music that Doc was playing was what interested me, not a sort of specific style.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? You hear the conversations of, you know, people talk about sort of the Mount Rushmore of flat picking or bluegrass guitar, and Doc Watson's always in there, and yet, like you say, in many ways, not really a bluegrass guitar player at all. You know, it's not like you hear Doc a load of times in that 5-piece bluegrass setting with a 5-string banjo and a fiddle and a bass, and Doc just took, and I think this, when I sort of knew this coming into these conversations, how vast his repertoire was, but I think it's really sort of hit home talking to people just how, I think because everything Doc did sounded like Doc, it's easy to miss just how wide the range of stuff that came in there really was.
Yeah, it was, and it didn't, you know, I probably didn't understand that until later. It just seemed to me like American traditional music played like nobody's business, you know, like this with this virtuoso guitar player. That just seemed like the kind of stuff there was, you know, and, you know, I was hearing Norman Blake at the same time, and he was, you know, he was that way as well, you know. In fact, I had a conversation with him once, and we were just talking about old time music as it sort of became, through more sort of the old time music revival in the 70s. And we talked about all the music that was sort of thought of as old time music to him, that included all this other stuff that has then sort of got narrowed down by people into just sort of fiddle tunes, sort of square dance tunes. But there were all this blues and this sort of like cakewalks and ragtime influence and all this other music that sort of disappeared from the what people thought of as traditional or old time music. So I don't know why that is, but the range just sort of, if you sort of look at Doc and Norman, there is really the sort of traditional flat pickers. And you know, I think the other thing about all those guys, and it's not just from Doc, but when I was learning that stuff, it was, you know, there was Doc and Norman, and, you know, then Tony soon for me, you know, because I was really learning this in like 1973, and so that was really when Tony kind of came up. I can't remember when that his first album Guitar came out, but it was right around then. There's Russ Barenberg. Who am I missing? Dan Crary, Clarence White. All those guys sound completely different, right? And so to me, there was no sort of, okay, if you're going to play this music, this is how you have to play. It's not, you know, if someone wants to learn bluegrass banjo, even these days, it's like, what do you learn? You learn how to play like Earl, and then you kind of move off from that, maybe, you know. But then it was sort of like, here's like 5 or 6 guys playing this all completely different. Like, so you can learn what they play, but you don't need to play how they play. You know, you can play what you hear and what you can do, and sort of create your own voice, because obviously they have.
Cool. That's Scott Nygaard. You'll be hearing from Scott again at the end of the episode, along with a few other people. But next up is a younger guitarist than some other people I've spoken to in this episode so far. We're going to talk to a couple of younger players now. And the first one is Chris Eldridge, who's guitarist with Punch Brothers and new band Mighty Poplar. And he talks about sort of coming to Doc's music and sort of learning to appreciate it a little bit later in his life, which I think is really interesting. So here comes Chris Eldridge.
For me, when I was a kid, there was something about Tony that was able to capture me at that stage in my development. It lined up with a lot of things I was already interested in. And Tony is and will always be my greatest hero. So nothing's going to change about that. But it's interesting. It did take me kind of getting a little bit older to appreciate the power inherent in just playing something with so much honesty. Doc was just, I kind of looked at Doc as this beacon, and Bill actually, but in a slightly different way. But I look at them as these beacons within this music of directness, just being yourself, just doing your thing. And Doc in particular. I mean, because Bill was this giant creative force who kind of invented bluegrass music. And you hear Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys playing bluegrass. And that as a band leader, he really was exerting a lot of an influence. Of course, he sounded like an individual, but he kind of had this vision for how the music went. Doc's thing to me is a little bit, it's inspiring in different ways, because he wasn't ever really a band leader in that same way, although he did amazing things with bands. But I feel like with Doc, he's this well you can always go to, because the essence of what makes all of that music great is that you have a guy who is so confident, or it's not even confidence. It's just like comfort. There's comfort in his own skin. He's so comfortable just doing music the way he does it, playing and singing songs in the way that he knows how to do them. And he's a person who's tremendously, tremendously, tremendously gifted. And technically, and he grew up in the music. He was blind, so I think music was kind of a way, something for him that world of sound was something for him to kind of sink into even more. But I think he just played these songs because that's what you did, and there wasn't really much artifice or pretense about it. It's just he had this standard of excellence. This is how I play this song, and I care about music, and I love music, and I'm going to do it well. And he had his heroes, his old time heroes, Clarence Ashley, or all these guys who he was around and listening to, who played his music in this direct, beautiful way. And so I feel like Doc just took that core of the old time music and took its deepest, most direct lessons and just rendered music in this way that was just so honest and direct. And I don't know, it took me getting older before I understood how completely powerful it was to just hear a human being themselves.
I was thinking as you were saying that about taking a while to appreciate sort of Doc just being so happy in his own skin, and maybe, and I don't know you, but I know me, and it takes a while sometimes to become comfortable in your own skin, and then you appreciate that in other people, and you sort of settle into this idea that that's your job as a human being, is to just be you, because nobody else can do it and you can't be anybody else. And I think sometimes that's something that can be incredibly attractive in any kind of art, is somebody just is comfortable doing what they do.
I don't think there's anything more compelling than that. It's amazing to see art where somebody has slaved over something and they've built, it's like the pyramids. Like gosh, the pyramids are just incredible. What an accomplishment. I love things like that too, where people have just had an idea and they've gone for it. And you're just like, wow, the human spirit, unbelievable. Somebody had this crazy idea and just did it. But I think, yeah, as I get older, there's nothing actually that moves me more than true sincerity, than just somebody being honest and sincere. It's funny, but I don't crave the big accomplishments as I get older. I crave knowing who people are, because everybody, as you get older, you realize just how hard life is and how complicated life is. And you, I think it's, for me anyway, I've gained more empathy for everybody else. Not that I feel like I was an unempathetic person before, but I think as you go on, you just realize that everybody's moved through this life, and it's been a struggle for everybody, and it's just beautiful to see who a person is, as they've kind of made that journey. And I think maybe that's why, as I've come to appreciate that more, as I look to someone like, or not someone like, but as I looked at Doc Watson, because he really is just kind of the ultimate beacon for me in terms of this thing, just being unpretentious. He just does it the way he did it. It's so honest. The way he sang was so unadorned. But you can't really imagine those songs being sung in a more direct manner than the way Doc would sing pretty much any song. It was playful. It's not like he wasn't in there. He was in there a lot, but it wasn't. There's just no artifice to it. You hear him singing some of these silly songs, where I can't think of anything right off the top of my head, but one of these playful songs, Froggy went a courtin' or something like that, and you'll hear him kind of make sound effects or whatever, and it's just playful and joyful, and he wasn't afraid of any of that. It's like, this is how the song goes, and he just presented it as it was, and nothing more. And I just love that. As I've gotten older, I've just come to be so moved by that and so inspired by that just being oneself is about as interesting as it can be, because like you said, each one of us is the only one of us that exists. And it's fascinating to actually take the time to learn about people and know who they are. And with someone like Doc, you kind of learn about who he is via how he plays music. I think maybe that's actually it. You actually learn a lot more. There's a lot of music you can listen to, and you can sort of learn about the people. You can learn about what they find interesting. You can learn about, and through that you might learn about what they want to present. But with Doc, there's no sense that he's trying to present anything other than just how the music goes, how he thinks the music goes. And that's so refreshing. That's so different. Even Tony, who I think was also a beacon of clarity in a way, I think Tony had really thought a lot about how these things should go, from a, not detached. I mean, it was his thing is so honest, but there was more of a presentation aspect, I think. And I could just be romanticizing Doc's thing. I never knew Doc. But I really get the sense that he just had this privilege of playing music, and he played it for people. And we were just lucky to hear this guy, hear this spirit, just coming through in such an honest, direct way.
Cool. That was Chris Eldridge. Always enjoyed talking to Chris. I could happily talk to Chris about music all night, every night. He's just, I think I find him really interesting and thoughtful, and just full of interesting insights. Next up, another young guitarist, Eddy, up and coming picker that I'm sure a lot of you have seen around. Jake, again, it's really interesting talking to him about Doc, and another common theme of these chats is about Doc and the place that Doc is from and how that is part of the music. And we touched on that with Jake, but yeah, his Jake Eddy, another really, really cool conversation.
The way I found Doc Watson was through songs and through material more so than through the artist himself. So like one of the first songs I ever heard on guitar, or one of the first songs I ever probably learned on guitar, I think it's one of the first tunes my mom ever learned to play, was Tom Dooley, kind of in the style of that Doc Watson recording. And I guess that was something my grandpa was really into, because he would show us so many of those tunes. I mean, I remember hearing him play like, Tom Dooley and like Muskrat or like country blues. It's like I remember hearing all that stuff growing up before I knew Doc, right? But then when I got into Doc, I was like, oh, these are all the songs my grandpa likes, right? And I could hear so much of his playing in my grandfather. So I think that kind of is what gets Doc near to my heart, is that I can hear him in all these guys that I knew and loved in my family growing up, And so then, like, when I got into Doc, listening to his recordings and stuff, I think the thing that kind of amazed me, aside from all that, was that he pretty much, to me, revolutionized the kind of C-shaped playing. I mean, Doc Watson has some of the best C-shaped fiddle tune vocabulary ever. Like, ever, period. And so, like, when you listen to Doc Watson play something like, like Whiskey Before Breakfast, or, I mean, that's a simple answer, but it's so good. I mean, anything that Doc plays that's in that kind of fiddle tune world, it's just great. And I think Doc's fiddle tune approach is a little bit more in the old time realm. I mean, he comes from, I don't want to say pre-bluegrass, but some of those Watson family recordings are kind of like, they're a little more old-timey, a little bit more in the hillbilly music thing. And so I think the way Doc approaches tunes is not necessarily from a bluegrass or flat-picking kind of perspective. He's thinking about the energy and the approach of old-time music and stuff like that. So I think that's something that kind of makes him unique.
Yeah, and he certainly came from that tradition of playing music for people to dance to.
Right, square dance.
Rather than sort of concerts, it was music for people to get up and move to.
Well, that's the thing about a lot of artists of that time, right? They became like, they were viewed as more sophisticated artists later, but that's not necessarily was their goal, right? Music back in the day was more about entertainment and stuff like that, before it was about anything artistic necessarily, I think. So, so yeah, I mean, and that's why I think Doc has so much raw energy, because he grew up like in the way of entertaining as opposed to trying to make a statement creatively or something like that at first.
Yeah, and maybe that's why there's that bit of swing and bounce in his playing that everybody loves, is because it's easy to tap your foot and dance to something when it's got a little swing in it.
Yeah, the energy is incredible, and Doc Watson knows tempos, man. Like, when you hear him playing fiddle tunes, they're always right where they should be, right in the pocket, and hard driving. And yeah, I mean, there's so much to be said about his time and his feel, and that's even just to lay the foundation before even mentioning all the things about his great creative playing. But just the approach and the time and the feel and the groove and all that stuff is so perfect, right? And he has cuts of every tune. I mean, Doc has been recorded so much, which is great.
It's really interesting what you're saying about C shapes, and there's a certain, obviously this is massively oversimplification, but there's lots of people when they play in G go for those Tony Rice sort of hot licks and stuff. But I think you're right. I'd never thought about this before, but when I play in C shapes, or I see other people playing C shapes, they always sound a bit like Doc Watson, because it's just so ingrained. It's such a familiar thing.
It's amazing, right? And I always forget, so Doc's born in the 20s, I think,
Yeah, so 23 be 100 this year.
That's right. Oh, yeah, that's right. So, so that should kind of, just to give you some perspective, like in the 40s, right, in 1943, he's 20 years old. Whereas, so he's like, he doesn't have obviously he's not really listened to Clarence White or anyone like that. He's doing his own thing. He doesn't have any of this, all this stuff that you hear kind of like you said, just all these hot licks and stuff that everyone's playing now. Doc Watson didn't get to hear that stuff, right? He's listening to fiddle players, banjo players. And so Clarence White is born when Doc Watson's like 21 or 22 years old or something like that. And Tony Rice is born in, I think, 51 or something. So, I mean, yeah, obviously those guys are not influencing Doc like that because he's already established his thing.
And at that point, I guess you've got the radio and you've got records coming in when Doc's a kid, but he's going to have heard and learned music from people around him as much as from anywhere else. And
well, especially being from Western North Carolina and everything. I mean, he's kind of from old time music Mecca, And so, like, I wonder what Doc would have grown up listening to. Probably Uncle Dave Macon and like some Jimmy Rogers music, and so I mean, there's different things going on, but it's not bluegrass music yet. That's for sure.
Yeah, and that definitely that Jimmy Rogers influence. I've heard Doc talk about finger picking in the sort of Carter family style, and then hearing Jimmy Rogers and some of those runs and thinking, well, you can only do that with a pick, and starting to flat pick a bit more.
Yeah.
Or as he put it back in the day, they called it a straight pick rather than a flat pick. But that Jimmy Rogers, that influenced certainly on him as a guitar player.
Well, and Doc sings and plays a lot of those kind of cowboy ballads anyway. So yeah, you can definitely hear the Jimmy Rogers thing, the influence there, I think, for sure.
Yeah, totally.
And so a lot of that's probably a cultural thing too. Like Jimmy Rogers was just a cool cat. Not only musicians dug him. But yeah.
Yeah, and there's something sort of really enduring about Doc's music because it is sort of timeless, even though it is very rooted to a particular place. And, something about hearing Doc's records from the 60s is also of that time, but at the same time, it just sounds like it's been around forever.
Yeah, man, it's... That's really the true statement about a lot of great art, right? That it sounds like it's time and place, but it doesn't sound dated. It doesn't sound old or out of style or anything like that. And I specifically love this stuff, man, when he's playing with his son. That's so near to me because I grew up playing in that kind of a role too. Like I just relate to that whole thing. I love the way it sounds, and it sounds familiar to me.
Yeah, Bryan Sutton said something really similar sort of about, his two reference points for becoming a guitarist were his dad and Doc Watson.
Yeah, man, I hear so much of Doc and Bryan's playing too sometimes. Yeah, it's great. I think that Doc Watson was a later influence for me through actually getting to listen to a lot of his material. Or rather, listen to his recordings of the material, but I knew a ton of the tunes through my grandfather growing up, and to look back, it was so obvious that he was lifting all that stuff from the Doc records. It's amazing.
Cool. That was Jake Eddy. Before we sort of finished talking about a couple of the younger players that have been influenced by Doc, I think pretty much every conversation I had for this podcast, pretty much everybody I talked to at some point mentioned Billy Strings and the work that Billy does to sort of promote Doc's music and the way that Billy carries that with him and is carrying it forward, and what an astonishing thing that is. I did try to get hold of Billy for this podcast, but as you can imagine, Billy's incredibly busy, and I didn't manage to talk to Billy. Maybe one day I will, but I think just wanted to acknowledge that in there, that just everybody at some point mentioned Billy, I think, and what an astonishing thing he's doing. And I just wanted to sort of drop that in there, really. Next person I'm going to talk to is author, musician and broadcaster Sid Griffin. And we talk a bit about place and a lot of these conversations about Doc, about where Doc grew up and where he's from and sort of what he like maybe represents as part of that. And Sid's got some really interesting thoughts about that, and just about Doc in general. So yeah, here comes Sid Griffin.
He was just a name growing up in Kentucky, which is my fault because, rock and roll obsessed kid. And now there's a banjo there and there's a acoustic guitar there, electric guitar there. And my taste is more widespread, but as a kid, I was mostly rock and roll. So anyway, it was just a name. And now that I think about it, he did play on a festival bill at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina, where I was an undergraduate. And, he was terrific. And it was just him and his son. And I don't remember T. Michael Coleman or anybody else being there. I know he was doing the Vanguard stuff at the time. And it's been a long time. We're talking like 1975. And it was just so different, the fat, full sound that two guys could get playing out of doors. Doc was just the guy. And when I later on read about him and researched him and found out he was just playing lead guitar in a country and western band, and he was just one of several. He wasn't like considered the guy or anything like that. And that when he started going out on his own acoustically, a lot of his drive was because he wanted to make money for his family, which is, perfectly fine with me. He did not have this, Bill Monroe wanted to make money, of course, but Monroe really was cognizant of where he was flying the flag for bluegrass as a genre. And Doc wanted to just make a good living for his growing family. And it's an absolutely amazing story that he found an audience with these New York beatnik / folkies on the Upper Coast. The first was Greenwich Village, of course, and Washington D.C., Baltimore's always had a bluegrass thing, but the Greenwich Village acceptance of it was amazing. Predictable now, but in hindsight, you might not have known it. And then up in Boston, Massachusetts, across the water is a town called Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Doc was the Club 47 guy. Club 47 is where people like Joan Baez broke. And Doc became a huge star at Club 47 and could do, instead of one night or two nights, he could do like 3 nights or whatever and sell it out. And who would have dreamed that a blind guy from North Carolina, who back in North Carolina was just one of the guys. He was not considered the Segovia or the Eric Clapton of his scene. And who would have dreamed that this would happen? It's an amazing story. I mean, I think there's another one on the sidebar. You know who Wayne Henderson is?
Yeah.
Kind of like that. I mean, Wayne Henderson's an amazing player, and he wanted to be a U.S. postman and get the steady income, and he's retired and got a pension. And I just think, God, what's in the water down there in Western North Carolina? It's incredible.
And it's funny, that story that you say about seeing Doc playing. I talked to so many people who've said the first memory of seeing Doc at a festival and just being blown away by the sort of directness of it. I spoke to Mike Marshall, and he said he spent a couple of days at a festival when he was a kid, and he saw J.D. Crowe with Tony Rice, and he saw and he just reeled off this list of all the names you would want to see at a festival. And he said the one that totally blew him away was Doc Watson.
Yeah. And it's funny because all these guitar magazines, they have the list of 100 greatest guitarists, and there's just, you realize there's not classical players on there with their incredibly developed right hands, and guys like Doc aren't mentioned, or if they are, they're down the list. And you realize how much people were in the mind bag that I was as an undergraduate, where a lot of it's based on speed, chromatic shredding and speed, and then of course this pounding, which is just one of the hallmarks of a lot of rock and roll, from heavy metal to punk, just this pounding. And you realize how Doc was just, there's a vulgarism down south, slicker than owl shit. Well, Doc's playing was slicker than owl shit. I mean, it was just beautiful. There were no nat notes or clams, and it was really something. And to think that it's a bit like Snuffy Jenkins was possibly, we don't ever know, the leading guy in Western North Carolina that really developed that. But Scruggs gets Earl Scruggs gets the credit. Don Reno was there as well, but Scruggs gets the credit. I mean, radio with Marconi, there were other people applying for patents at the same time. Their patent didn't come through, and we give it to Marconi, the credit for radio. It's just the way it is. And Doc, there was a lot of pickers down there, but I think Doc justifiably gets the credit at taking it out. If you listen to Bill and Charlie Monroe before he had the Bluegrass Boys, Charlie's just playing simple fills. He's kind of doing what Merle does when Doc does his leads, or the other way around when Merle does his picking. It's sort of that just basic. And that's great. But Doc took it to another level. In Bill's band, as you know, he didn't have a lead guitar player. And I've often wondered if he didn't want the competition, because, you know, Bill Monroe was a dear friend with Doc Watson. And he'd felt the sense of competition that came in when Earl was in the band. Earl Scruggs was in the band. And Monroe, we know, felt the sense of competition when Chubby Weiss was in the band, and then Kenny Baker. So I'm wondering if Monroe thought, do I really want to have a hotshot guitar player as well? Because Monroe was such a brilliant mandolin player. But Monroe's guys are just, you know. And that's all that those guys did till Doc. Doc, he may not have been the first. I don't really know. But he's the one that gets the credit as popularizing it. You know, he's not the Snuffy Jenkins that stayed behind in North Carolina. He's more the Don Reno or the Earl Scruggs that went out to the world and now gets credit for it. I mean, he's the guy. And it was so different. You know, the folkies were just used to that simple Monroe backup kind of thing, the Charlie Monroe backup. Although that Lester Flatt played that kind of backup with Earl. Really simple stuff. And no one was used to a guy flying like that. And, of course, then he gives birth to, say, Clarence White. And Clarence White gives birth, musically speaking, to Tony Rice. And now look at what we've got today. I mean, Doc is a foundation stone in the way that Robert Johnson's a foundation stone for blues music.
Yeah, and it's that combination of the Maybelle Carter style rhythm with the Jimmy Rogers flat picked runs and the Merle Travis finger picked stuff. Just put it all together into this sort of package, and it's a new thing.
When I was doing this book, I don't know if I'm interrupting, I don't mean to. Some of the people I interviewed were saying his lack of sight may have given him, let me have sad pun, a clear view of what to do musically. In other words, we know that people heard Maybelle Carter and other people hearing Maybelle Carter, they thought it was two guitars, and she didn't realize her style is based on not really realizing from a mono scratchy 78 or broadcast 16 RPM record that you might have been hearing. She didn't realize what she was hearing, so she's trying to do it all at once. Well, Doc's a bit like that. I mean, Doc's shifting from backup to lead, which is so slick and so smooth. It's not a rock guy who's playing sort of Chuck Berry leads or single note Clapton-esque leads and then goes to chords. It's like chords or lead. Doc's is an amalgamation of both of them. It's very slick, very easily done. He doesn't just go to chords and then hit single notes and then go back. And I think part of that is due to the challenge of not having sight, that maybe his ears were developed to the point where he heard and things more clearly and imagined things that a sighted guy who would, if you're picking, I'm looking at your hands. Well, Doc doesn't have that advantage, so he's got to, where can he go? And I'm thinking his being sightless played a big part in the sounds that he heard. There was a great book called something like, Billy Bragg, of all people, had a copy of it. We were laughing because the American cover and the British cover were so different. It was talking about, bluegrass America's music, but the British cover had the Southwest with a sort of Arizona Mesa-like desert scene, which of course is not where bluegrass is from. And he and I were laughing about that. But there's a great story in this book that Doc's outside sitting on a chair and he says, he says, Matt, go get that guitar that's under the bed and we'll pick some. And the guy goes the 40 feet into the house. It's a quiet summer's afternoon. And he pulls a guitar case out under the bed and he clicks open, and Doc hears the clicks and says to this guy, no, not that one, the Martin. And the guy looks in the case, and it is a Gibson. All Doc has heard is the latches coming up from this guy. That's how developed his ear was. Isn't that amazing? I think that played a great deal in the development of his playing, and maybe the fearlessness or the ability to go through boundaries of his playing, because he was a pioneer, no question about it.
I think that's a really interesting point about when people think about like Bill Monroe and Doc Watson and that generation of acoustic musicians. That's now become the tradition, but they were all incredibly progressive at their time.
Yeah.
Like they're obviously very rooted in tradition, but they were pushing where this could go constantly.
Yeah, there's no question. And it's a shame because, Monroe, he was working on a new music when he died, and he had this thing about, well, would the public want to hear a new sound from me? And it's a shame that some of the folk, acoustic, whatever you want to say, players of Americana get in that bag, because if you look at Tony Rice, they do want you to shift around, I feel. They do want you to expand the envelope. And Monroe and some of that crowd thought, well, I'll be letting down the bluegrassers if I do this new kind of music. And I think, I don't know. Who knows? I wonder if Doc, when he added the muted bass and the muted drums, if he wanted to expand his audience, or it was just a musical experiment, or what. I guess we'll never know unless you speak to somebody who's very, very close to him. Maybe Jack Lawrence might know. He's been at Sore Fingers. He might know. But it's obvious that Watson, he just didn't see the barriers that a lot of people saw. And it's also interesting that when he did play with Monroe, they went back to Bill and Charlie, right? Monroe, when he played with Doc Watson, because they were dear friends, I've got video footage just over on the shelf of them playing together. They didn't do bluegrassy things. They did the Bill and Charlie Monroe routine, if you would. And of course, with all respect to the late Charlie Monroe, who was very good, he was not a patch on what Doc could do. I mean, Doc playing with Bill Monroe on the lawn of the White House for Jimmy Carter. You've probably seen that footage. It's on YouTube. It just takes it to a whole another level. It's just insane that those two guys playing, two virtuosos matching each other spot for spot. Incredible.
Yeah, and you wonder kind of if Bill had a bit more of that, if stuff might have gone in a different direction, if he'd spent some more time.
Monroe had this new music towards the end of his life based had a trombone in it of all instruments, and he didn't have the chutzpah or he just felt that it was too much for his audience, and I think that was a huge mistake. I mean, it's odd because the whole thing about the Appalachians, Kentucky, the state I'm from, is people moved. It was the barrier to the rest of the country. And the United States hugged the East Coast. The Appalachians were a huge barrier. They have these pathetic wagons and mules, and it's different. And when they found the Cumberland Gap, before then, people just came down the Ohio a bit and the Cumberland Gap, and the Appalachians were populated. And then as ways to move west expanded, we knew other ways to get west, a multiplicity of ways besides floating down the Ohio River and coming in the Cumberland Gap came. All those people, Doc's antecedents, were left, and they didn't get a new flow of people. So their culture stayed the same for like 200 years. It's a very important point. In East London, I only know this because I just read this London history book. East London's had waves. The East End has had waves of immigrants come in, waves. And they've been Jewish for a while, and then they've been Italian for a while, and do the influx and the ructions going on in the continent of Europe. They've been French, they've been whatever. And Appalachia didn't have that. The people, the Scots-Irish that went there in the 1700s and early 1800s, as more ways went of going west, they were bypassed. The Appalachians just stayed the same. And that culture stayed that way, certainly till radio, and really not even till radio. 10 years after radio, when Roosevelt got the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, the TVA Act, and brought electricity to the nonprofit areas of eastern Kentucky, the government socialism, if you will, and people heard the radio, they had no idea what was out there. People still spoke in ye and thou and thusly and verily I say unto you and all this crazy stuff. And Doc was a son of that kind of culture. And then TV kind of ruined it. And now you can go to Appalachia. It's more or less like the rest of the country in that there could be a Pizza Hut there. But Doc grew up at a time when people did, they did those ballads like, fair young maid, all in her garden, brave young man came riding by, said, fair young maid. Well, who sings about fair young maid and stuff now? And the answer is people like Monroe, who does his Pretty Little Maid in the Garden. And a lot of people know it as John Riley. I think Joan Baez cut it as John Riley. That was just a folk song of the time. It had like 17 verses, which was all chopped down by Joan Baez and people to make it palatable to modern taste. But songs like that they existed. I mean, Soldier's Joy, you could have heard the American Revolutionary Army of George Washington and the British troops. I don't think they'd both call it Soldier's Joy. Maybe they would. They were both playing it on the fiddle. That's 250 years ago. That's amazing around the campfires at night. And Doc would have known that song like that. Appalachia, these crazy things were preserved. And he brought that culture, Doc Watson, when he played the Club 47 in Cambridge to those Harvard students and Joe Boyd and Bob Newirth and Bob Dylan, and we played in New York to Phil Oakes and Tim Hardin and Tom Paxton and all that crowd in New York. A lot of those songs they didn't know. They did not know. And if they did know them, it's because they helped, part of that 1950s folk scare, as we call it in America, the great 1950s, early 60s folk scare. And he brought songs and an attitude that people did not know, were completely unaware of. I mean, it's like a voice from the past matched with the pushing forward and a desire to go into the future. I mean, he's incredible. Somebody was talking about the great names of American music. You have Louis Armstrong, and you have, that are really important, Duke Ellington, and you have Aretha Franklin, and you have Bill Monroe, and I've noticed Miles Davis, and I noticed Doc Watson's name was on that list. Oh, I know it was. The Smithsonian Institute in Washington was having this list of the important American dozen you have to be familiar with, and Watson was on it, justifiably so. And one of the weird changes that happened was when, as Watson said in some interviews when I was doing my book, is just playing to people that were exclusively listening. Exclusively listening. He'd been playing dances, and then he'd been playing a mixture of dances and fellers over by the wall with a whiskey or a beer or whatever, just listening and enjoying the picking. And now, once he starts, and Berkeley had a big scene out in the East Bay of San Francisco. What was the one in L.A., the Ash Grove? Once you start playing the Ash Grove in L.A., where Doc Watson did with Merle, and blew people's minds. Had Clarence White in the front row. He was just a kid then. At first, it was odd because exclusively listening, no dancing, no shuffling the feet, no nothing. But that is where that boom, boom, boom comes down. There's a slightly harder downbeat because people are pushing off of it, literally on the dance floor. And it must have been a heck of a change, but all of a sudden everybody's hanging on every note.
That's sort of what the Beatles did, isn't it? That's what the Beatles in Hamburg was for, really, was them just playing for people to dance to.
Yeah, people think they were sitting there watching the Beatles. No, they weren't. They were dancing.
And drinking and fighting.
And fighting, yeah, I agree. They're fighting. But it must have been quite a sea change, because at first it was a performance that was the lubricant for romance and for dancing, and with some chatting in the background. And it must have been incredibly different to play even when you speak, it's silent.
Cool. That was Sid Griffin. I live in the same city as Sid, and I think we've crossed like the same musical Venn diagrams at all sorts of different points over probably the past 10, 15 years. And I've never actually met him, but it was a joy talking to Sid. I really enjoyed that. And next up, I've got Tim O'Brien. Obviously, Tim O'Brien is a legend. And as you'll hear sort of from the intro to this, when I talked to Scott Nygaard, he talked about Tim as being somebody akin to Doc in terms of sort of the breadth of music he covers. But yeah, this was, again, somebody I hadn't talked to before. I talked to him for this podcast and had such a fascinating conversation. Really interesting. So here is Tim O'Brien. And when I spoke to Scott Nygaard for this a few weeks ago, he said, you should talk to Tim O'Brien because in some ways he's like most naturally following in Doc's footsteps because of the range of music that he plays. And Scott sort of drew a very definite parallel between you as artists because of the range, even though you're sort of considered traditional folk musicians. Like the range of music is interesting.
Yeah, well, Doc is definitely considered traditional folk music too. But if you look at his repertoire, it goes all over the place. And he'd sing "Nights in White Satin" by the Moody Blues. He would sing rockabilly songs by Elvis. He would sing "Summertime." He would sing. That's George Gershwin. So he'd sing all kinds of things, and then contemporary folk things. "Gentle on My," or not gentle. "Last Thing on My Mind." That kind of thing by Tom Paxton. In addition to the stuff that he grew up with, that his father-in-law played, the fiddling and the ballad singing and stuff from around there in Deep Gap, and just country music, just what we heard on the radio. But it's interesting what Ralph Rinsler did, was he kind of woke him up and said, "Look, you occupy a special position, and you really could make a difference for everybody here." And it's really great that he took up Ralph's idea. He shows up to the recording session with an electric guitar, and they go, "Well, you can't use this." And he says, "Well, this is what I have. What is wrong with this?" And he gets this sort of crash course on where he is and who he is within the scene, from Ralph. And going to New York, I think, is any kind of good artist. It's an important thing to go there and to have people hear you and see what you do, but also for you to see what other people are doing and get a perspective on it. And he was a smart enough guy and mature enough before he ever did any of that stuff that he was able to put it all together and slyly pose as this traditional musician and put this stuff forward. It's he did bring traditional music right to the front for people because of his delivery and because of his his technique. He wasn't, there are other people that have the great technique like Bill Monroe, but they were a little more strident in the way they presented it, and it was harder to latch onto. Doc was really like a fuzzy couch that you could sit on and take this stuff in.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that, because there's lots of musicians who are as comfortable in their musical skin as Doc Watson, but to have that and also be open to suggestion and taking a different route does require, like you say, a kind of maturity and a kind of openness.
Yeah, he was older than the folkies that were coming up, and he wasn't that old. So it's kind of like, I don't know, he was approachable. Like, it's interesting, people like Earl Scruggs looked him up because they know obviously of his talent. They, Flatt and Scruggs recording with him was a big thing. That's the first record I had of Doc Watson, the first one I could find. But, my first glimpse of Doc was on a folk music festival broadcast on TV from Berkeley, California. And he was completely solo. They kind of brought him up. Somebody guided him up to his microphone and got him there and sort of set the microphones, and he was off and running with his harmonica rack and flat picking guitar. And it was just like so stunning and so immediate to me. I had heard some bluegrass kind of stuff, but not like lead guitar like that. And it just, everything made sense all of a sudden.
And was it the sort of range of music or the delivery, or I mean, it's maybe impossible to pinpoint one thing that really drew you to the music at that point, but there's something to have made such a clear impression on you. Is there anything particular that stood out?
Yeah, the guitar was really the thing that drew me in because I was really interested in I was playing the guitar, 2 hours a day anyway, and to listen to that stuff and try to learn it was really great, and it was a mountain of technique to jump onto. And, but there was, it was obvious that was the right avenue for me. It was, I felt like I could approach it. It wasn't forbidding. And the other thing about Doc too, is like when you hear those solo records, you go, oh, that's all you need, to put a thing across. a guitar and a voice, and he played harmonica on the rack, and he was one of the better ones to do that. But really, the guitar and the voice, Dylan was that way. You'd hear Dylan, you'd hear Pete Seeger with his one instrument and his singing, and it was, come across. But with Doc, it was like a whole band there. It was like a really beautiful thing. The other things were like that. There were some of the ragtime guitar players, that you could hear. And I got into Reverend Gary Davis and his kind of thing. But I was just kind of, I was kind of new at everything. And it was a big, I was just on the tip of several icebergs. And Doc was the one that was the nicest, friendliest iceberg.
It's really interesting what you said earlier about the approachability of Doc compared to some of the sort of the other players, sort of about Bill Monroe being a bit more strident and, Doc having something that could appeal to most ears. Because I've heard you say before, I think it might have been on the Grey Fox documentary, Bluegrass Journey, is it called? About bluegrass being a strong spice, and it is. Yeah. It's not to everybody's ear, but somebody like Doc who can take all the similar source material and just put it across in such an approachable way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really true that it's, bluegrass is like your first. If you listen to Bill Monroe or Stanley Brothers to begin with, it's like really strong whiskey. And you the first time you have whiskey, you go, why would anybody drink this? Of course, there's an effect that it gives you after the fact, after drinking it, but then you get into the taste later and the subtleties of it. And that's what that kind of bluegrass is. It's really hard. And some of the blues is that way too. It's kind of just, and jazz, it's kind of like, why would anybody go for this? And then you gradually develop a taste for it. But Doc was like, his singing especially was really, welcoming. It was really, he had this beautiful sound, and he had a kind of a tenor, but it wasn't like a real high nasal tenor. It was just, I don't know. He was into pop music, and he probably shaped his sound around that stuff. And maybe, I don't know how much Ralph Rinsler had to do with how he shaped any of that stuff, but I think Ralph reminded him to keep it folksy, but I think he used his just general sensibilities to shape it the way, to present it the way he did.
Yeah, and that's sort of one of the things that's come across most from talking to people for this podcast is just the things people talk about are the sort of directness of delivery and the range of music, but also that thing of being able to take pretty much anything and make it sound like Doc Watson.
He was striving to be a regular guy. He really did not want to dwell on his handicap. And I think that was part of the thing that you really respected him for right off the bat. Here's this guy from the hills, and he plays this old music, but he's obviously a brilliant, musician and artist, a great developed personality. And, like I say, he was a smart guy. It's sort of disarming when you first hear it. It's like, I don't know why, but I just loved it. And I've tried to figure it out in years since, what it was. And that's as close as I can see. Is it's just the guitar drew me in, and it was just so easy and comfortable compared to a lot of roots music.
Has that sort of been an influence on you in your career? Because your repertoire is pretty vast, whether it's Scots Irish music or bluegrass or country or pop. There's a real range there, but you can put on any Tim O'Brien record and it sounds like Tim O'Brien. Is that something you think Doc maybe had a hand in as well?
I suppose so. Yeah. I mean, actually Thelonious Monk has he wrote down some rules for his musicians, and one of them was the guy who sounds the most like himself is the genius. And you got to get a sense of who you are as an artist to make to make a headway. You have to have a certain direction, or you just spin 360 degrees around in circles and don't go very far. So, I don't know. Doc, like I say, he had that sense of himself and what his mission was in a way. And I've always tried to find my own sound. Another template that works for me stylistically as a songwriter, singer-songwriter, and multi-instrumentalist is John Hartford, who always was looking for a new thing, and he was often kind of, his mind would wander into different territory, but he always kept his feet in the tradition. And he was a little more extreme than Doc, a little more, more fairy dust than Doc, and more, ethereal or something. He was earthy, but it's kind of just a different thing. But, some people like that, Ry Cooder comes to mind. He has a style. He borrows from everything, but it always sounds like Ry Cooder. And that's the thing that I want to, strive for as an artist, is to have an identity. That's songwriting is part of that. And, the kind of music you do and what you like to do, it's a product of what you're good at and what you're not good at, and kind of chipping away at the weak points and emphasizing the strong points too. So, I'm sure that was part of Doc's modus operandi as well.
And I think that's really interesting, because I think when you start playing music, you desperately want to sound like other people that you admire. And the thing that the hardest thing maybe in music is to be completely you.
Yeah.
But that's sort of the point of being you, is to be you, because nobody else can do it. But it's the hardest thing to get to.
Yeah. Well, nobody is completely original, and also nobody is completely traditional. They just can't be. I mean, I can play Deep River Blues pretty much like Doc did on the Doc Watson on Stage record. That's where I learned it from. But it doesn't sound like him at all. And I just can't. It just doesn't work. And also, I can't leave it behind. It's there. It's you just get on and play. And every person has their own thing that they can and will do if they set their mind to it, or if they, you just put your attention on things and it finally emerges. But it's a lesson that's hard to learn, that nobody's completely original and nobody's completely traditional. It's just we're all on a path of tradition that's going forward. It's just that's the way it is.
And it's really, I think that point that you made about Doc being pegged as a traditional or folk musician, or actually Doc's a pretty progressive musician in many ways. So many of the people that we look back to as being cornerstones of the tradition of bluegrass string band music, like the Bill Monroes and the Earl Scruggs, they were progressive musicians. They weren't just doing what come before them. Yeah.
Yeah. Bill Monroe's a real radical. Earl Scruggs was a real consummate artist, radical too, he was just, he took something and made it so smooth and so palatable, presented it on a plate to you that you couldn't refuse. And those guys were Bill Monroe's. I think his radical music was really exciting to people, and that the tempo and the virtuosity of those players, Scruggs and Monroe himself and Chubby Wise on the fiddle, that and the rhythm section, everything was pretty dang tidy. It was pretty world class. They had just there was no fat on it, and nobody was holding anybody back. And I think that excitement is one of the things about old time music, and bluegrass music is kind of a hyped up version of folk music, as what is it? Alan Lomax called it folk music in overdrive. It's the fast picking is really kind of a real piece of sugar that you want to take a bite of. And so Doc, when he play that Browns Ferry Blues, he just play the hell out of the guitar, and you go, God, how can anybody play that many notes? And some run, he'd do that chromatic run where he'd go da da all the way, from C up to C or back, or backwards. And you go, I didn't know there were that many notes between those two notes, but he put them in and it fit just perfectly in time. And it just gives you something to grab onto.
Yeah, I talked to the guitarist Jake Eddy for this, and he was saying that just when he thinks of Doc Watson, he just thinks of the most perfect playing of bluegrass style guitar out of C positions. Like anybody plays in a C position now, he thinks of Doc Watson because everybody's got a bit of Doc's influence in those shapes now.
Yeah. Doc is, Doc and there's in bluegrass guitar playing, the roots of it. You have George Shuffler and Don Reno and Doc Watson, and as far as lead playing, and then the Clarence White comes along and he kind of morphs it, and Tony Rice is kind of like the next extension of that. And Tony Rice was kind of like, a lot of people complain about fiddling and how it all got homogenized with the Grand Ole Opry and Arthur Smith, and everybody started playing like Arthur Smith, and it was like, oh, we don't hear the old kind of music anymore. And Tony Rice kind of did that with bluegrass guitar. It's kind of, that's what you hear. But if you unpeel a layer or two of that, Doc's in there too. He's kind of the basis of it. And Shuffler and Don Reno are there too. But Doc was very visible and very audible, in those 60s and early 70s. When the Will the Circle Be Unbroken record came out, my friend and I were at a party. It was, I think, a New Year's Eve gathering. And I was probably about 1971 or 2. I was probably 18. And, I thought, oh, I know this guy, Doc. I know who Doc Watson is. And I kind of know who Jimmy Martin and Roy Acuff were and that kind of thing, and Mabel Carter. And my friend and I said, yeah, you got to play guitar about 20 years before you can get a tone like that. And that was like, we thought, in a couple more years, we'll be able to get that tone. But it just doesn't happen. It's Doc's tone. But that's what you aspire to. That's what I aspire to. Not only the stuff that he played, but the tone he got, and just the clarity and the, precision of the presentation, was a beautiful sound.
Yeah, I talked to Bryan Sutton for this, and he sort of described it as like sort of the clarity of just hearing drops of water, just, these just clear, complete notes.
Yeah. His sound was, and, I think playing electric has a real role in that precision. When you play an electric, the extraneous noise is much louder. It's just jarring. I know playing with the pickups on my guitars and mandolins and fiddles really made me aware of that stuff. Getting sort of extraneous trash, kind of trying to leave it out and trying to be precise, and trying to think of the articulation of people like Doc Watson. It was what you'd aspire to. And Doc played, he played square dance tunes on electric guitar. So it was about getting that melody out and make people dance with the melody, which is what fiddle players do with just a melody, and they don't need chords and that kind of thing. So he was doing that with a guitar. He's taken, in a way, when he started doing that, it would have been hard to do it and drive a dance with an acoustic guitar. I think nowadays you could do it, but I think when he was doing it, it was having the Les Paul or whatever he was playing was probably really helpful. And but that refines your technique. You really, you're louder, and you have to pick and choose what you're going to send out there. If you have a sensibility about it, you work on it, getting the tone.
And that's really interesting, actually, because sort of through his career in certainly the later years, he would play an acoustic guitar plugged in, when a lot of other people would have just used mics. And having had that clarity in there made it very easy for him to do that, I guess.
Well, what you heard on the records was had no pickups, and that was what you aspired to, when you played, and what you liked about him. So the pickup sound was always kind of a compromise, but Doc was not. That's one of the things. Another thing about him, obviously, he was not a purist. He was going to plug that guitar in, and it was going to be loud enough for him to hear what he was doing. And there's a thing about that. If you have it loud enough, I think when you play at home and you can hear everything really clearly in a quiet room, it's a lot different than playing on stage or playing in a rehearsal room or, with other people around, other musicians going against you or playing with you. It covers up stuff, and that stuff is hard. It's hard to get comfortable. And Doc knew that, if I get loud enough, then I can hear he can play with the finesse that he wanted to play with. That the volume really helps you, keeps you from overplaying, pushing too hard. And Bryan Sutton will talk about tension and playing, and how it's, you kind of want to play harder and harder when you're playing in a bluegrass band, and it just you get to where you're holding yourself back, and to be able to remember that is tough on the stage. So just having yourself louder helps a lot. So that's why I can say, I think, Doc learned how to play cleanly from playing loud.
Cool. I've got one more guest for you. And I thought it'd be interesting to finish with something that maybe talks a bit about handing over the baton to another generation, because there's a very definite moment that happened with Doc, and I'm going to let my next guest explain to you what that was. This is Ketch Secor, frontman, founding member of Old Crow Medicine Show, and their story was, kicked off in part by a chance encounter with Doc, and so I'm going to let Ketch tell you about this. This is Ketch Secor from Old Crow Medicine Show.
When I knew Doc Watson, he was 75 when I met him. Wow. And so still a very old man, not 100 like Eddy now. But I met Doc Watson in Boone, North Carolina when I was about 18 years old. I was playing on the street corner with Old Crow Medicine Show in front of Boone Drug, which was the place that we later learned Doc loved to get, fried bologna sandwiches and Coca-Cola and whatnot. Well, we were busking there on the 5th of July in the year 1999. And this lady came up to us, and a lot of ladies came up to us because we were pretty good looking, though I don't think we smelled very good. Anyhow, she said, "Are you going to be here for a while? Because my daddy loves this kind of music." And we didn't think anything of it, and we said, "Well, we don't know, maybe check back." So thankfully, there must have been some good tipping that day. We stuck around long enough for Nancy Watson to come back with her dad. She parked a red Jeep Cherokee across the street, and she started walking her dad, Doc Watson. When he got about halfway across the street, we all could see what was going on, and we were just kind of dumbfounded. But we didn't stop the tune. We kept on playing it. And he got closer and closer, and then he listened in and kind of drank us in with his big ears. And then we got to talking after we finished playing the song. And he gave us a gig at Merle Fest right on the spot. And then he went in, got that fried bologna sandwich. And we went home knowing that we had just gotten the biggest break of our career.
What I love about having heard that story is that the story doesn't stop there. Like, I've heard you tell it before, that you got your break at Millfest, but actually that didn't go as well as you thought it would, and so you had to sort of improvise there. I heard you saying that the set wasn't that great. You weren't used to big stages and lots of microphones, so you just ended up going and busking instead, and then you got another big break from that.
Yeah, once Doc gave us this big gig, we kind of didn't know what to do with it because we'd never gotten a shot like this before. And we got to Merle Fest and just made a kind of unruly mess of our set. Feedback. It was a 2:00 set at the traditional dance stage. I think we were pretty hungover. I don't think we did a very good job, and it just had very little response. So it's like, oh well, there it was. That's what Doc give you, and that's what you made of it. So it was pretty depressing, and we were the kind of band that was not to be, we weren't going to be denied. So we went ahead and set up our own stage, and we just played all day and busked, and that kind of busking ethos kicked in, and we made a big noise and made it on the cover of the Wilkesboro newspaper, and really endeared ourselves to the Watson family after that. We were discovered at Merlefest by Sally Williams from the Grand Ole Opry, who called us about 3 or 4 weeks later to invite us to Nashville. So the chance encounter with Doc led to a whole lot of other encounters that have really enriched my life, but it all began on King Street in Boone. And so I just want to say thank you, Doc Watson, and thank you especially to Rosa Lee, without whom none of this would have been possible.
It's really cool, and there's something beautiful about that sort of, the old guard giving the new guard a hand up, because it's how it works a lot in this music. And I'm talking to John McEwen tonight about recording Will the Circle Be Unbroken, which was a big part of Doc sort of getting a national audience. And the idea that just keeps passing on, and, Old Crow will pass that on to other people and already have, I'm sure. And the idea that this music just keeps being handed on and handed on and handed on is a thing of beauty, I think.
Well, it's really well-handled music. And I know that Doc bared a torch that had been passed to him by his in-laws, by Gaither Carlton, by a traditional music scene in Northwest North Carolina that, spurred him on, and that talent was, better focused by Ralph Rinsler and others. But, one of the things I love most about sharing this crossroads in Boone with Doc is that we were playing in basically the same spot that Doc used to play, because Doc was a street performer on King Street in Boone too. When Doc Watson used to play on the curb in Boone back in the 1950s, he had to play right next to the outlet because he needed a place to plug in. Because when Doc was busking, he was a rock and roller greaser Hellcat. He wasn't up there singing "Oh Me Wise." And I just think that when you think about Doc as a greaser, as a rock and roller, as a country picker, and not as a folk singer, I think you get closer to what the gift from Doc Watson really is. Doc made a lot of sacrifices, and he made choices that really enriched the music scene, and you could see in his later output that he was not bound by the traditional folk music that he learned up there in Deep Gap. That music held no boundaries for him. He might play, bluegrass 1 minute, and then the next he was, singing, some torch ballad, or he might be covering a Ralph McTell song. Whatever it was, Doc was unbound, and I think that's something that really made a big difference in my life. Being exposed to a musician who had one foot so firmly rooted in the tradition, but the other one reaching so wide and far from it.
Yeah, and that's great. I think the that sense of sort of rooted and progressive at the same time is such a powerful combination. And you hear it with Old Crow, you hear it with, I don't know, Billy Strings, like an absolute foot in the tradition, and then an absolute desire to take that wherever you personally want to take it. And that's the best of it for me.
Yeah, well, you know, if you learn from the legends, then you get to carry a little bit of them with you.
Yeah. It's interesting. One thing I've heard you say about Old Crow is you've sort of said, we want to be the hometown boys in any town. And there's something about that connection with people that feels like akin to the thing that people say. I never saw Doc play live, but people say that wherever Doc went, he had this ability to make everybody feel like they were just sat in his living room with him.
Yeah, that's it's so important if you play traditional music to offer that invitation to people listening to you to step back in time with you. I mean, it kind of it's a beckoning kind of ritual anyway. Just when you get your fiddle out of the case, you know, you think about, you know, old grandma pulling her banjo down off the wall. You know, that's the opening of the wardrobe that the kids all sneak into to go enter into the other world. And, you know, this is a magical type of expression, making traditional American folk music, because its parentage is so disastrously rich. It's such a beautiful and broken legacy that you know, that when you look the parents in the eye of this music, you're like, it's like when Luke Skywalker learns that Darth Vader's his dad. No.
Yeah, and do you think that sort of the symbolism of that, taking the fiddle down, beckoning people in, do you think that's even more important now? Because obviously, you know, when Doc started playing music and where Doc started playing music, like, you could buy records, you could listen to the radio, or if you wanted music, you could make it yourself. But music wasn't just there to be summoned at the tap of a finger like it is now. And we're sort of saturated with availability of things now. So do you think that initial gesture of sort of beckoning people out of the immediate day-to-day life and into another time, do you think that becomes more important as a result?
Well, I got into traditional music because of the very point you're raising, that the nowadays of those days had a palpable feeling of an abandonment of the traditions. You know, you listen to the clear channel radio was sort of what we blamed it all on in the 90s. It's like, oh, the DJs don't get to pick anymore what they play. And that's just a long trail full of stepping stones that bring us to the current era in which, you know, the traditions of music are about as far away from the media in which you listen to it. And yet you look at records like Will the Circle Be Unbroken, and the way that the Dirt Band, you know, basically took the time to symbolically take the old fiddle down. You know, that was an expression that, you know, by doing it, by symbolizing it for a new generation, they ensured that every subsequent generation could build upon that. You know, that's a groundbreaking record because they, to some extent, did it kind of first. You know, the long hairs hadn't yet said, yeah, our heroes are Roy Acuff and Doc Watson and Maybelle Carter. You know, those were hard heroes to have in the counterculture until you realize that they weren't. But by symbolizing that for the rest of us, the job of you know, carrying the torch is a lot easier.
And that's almost it. I'm sort of this is the point where I should probably sum up what these interviews have meant to me, and it's so hard to do. I've spent 2 months just having the most fascinating conversations and kind of learning about Doc, and I've listened to Doc a lot more with a newfound sense of wonder and respect. But the thing that I've come away from these with more than anything is not a bigger love of Doc's music, or it's just seeing the joy with which this bunch of people talk about Doc as a human, as a musician, as a figure, as just a person who has touched their life in some way, and that's a really joyous thing. And at the end of all the interviews, I asked people a bunch of questions, and we talked about all the things that you've heard in the episodes. But at the end, I said, "Is there anything else you want to tell me about Doc?" And some of my favourite moments came out of those just casual, got one more thing to tell me kind of things. So I'm going to just finish with a few of those, just because some of them were lovely, and it just a little different perspective and a little intimate moment, or just a story about Doc. And so we're going to lead out first with Bryan Sutton.
The only thing I would add that I think is important, in well, for me, like an honest sort of assessment of Doc Watson is that, again, a lot of us sort of felt this kind of grandfatherly, pat on the shoulder, sort of genteel kind of thing from Doc. And he was certainly that, but he, as a sincere artist, he is a passionate character, and he had all those too. And I think it's we want to remember him as this, again, that genteel character, but he was fiery, and could be that way. And that's why those songs have that kind of emotion and willingness and that, that clarity and things like that. It was just, he had it all.
So that was Bryan Sutton. I've also got one more final story from Scott Nygaard that I couldn't leave out. I think this is really cool. So yeah, I'm going to leave you with one more thought from Scott Nygaard.
Early 80s, I was mostly playing with my then wife, the singer-songwriter Linda Waterfall. And Doc was playing a gig in one of the San Juan Islands in Washington State. And he was playing with Merle. And our sound man was asked to do sound for him and go up and take stuff up there. And he couldn't do it, but he suggested that Linda and I do sound for Doc because we knew this PA, we could go up there, I was like, yes, please, And so we went up and did sound him, and then when the promoter discovered that we were going to be doing sound, they said, well, why don't you open for him? So we opened for him, but it was really stressful because, we're like doing a sound check, and then for Doc, and first for ourselves and then for ourselves. And then we have to run back and get ready. And then we go up and perform, and then we have to run back to the board and do sound for Doc. But there was this great moment when we were in the dressing room, and, we kind of said hi to Doc, and, I said something about, how much he influenced me or something. And he just, smiled and, didn't say much. But so Linda and I were warming up, and we would often sing this traditional song, "Oh Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan," just as a sort of vocal warm up. And, we would perform it sometimes too, and we were in kind of we wanted to leave Doc. He was kind of there in the dressing room by himself, and just kind of leave him alone. So we were over in the opposite corner, and we're singing, and all of a sudden we hear this bass voice, just singing along with us. So we warmed up with Doc singing bass to us, and that was pretty great. The funny thing about that gig too is it was on one of these islands in the Sound, and you take a ferry to get there. So the next morning, and he was there with Merle, and we ended up going to a big party, having a big party with Merle, and Doc went back and got some sleep, and then we met them along with some other people, the promoter and whatever. For breakfast the next morning. There was a place right by the ferry dock. So we're like, well, wait, we'll have breakfast, and then you can get right on the ferry. And so we're there having breakfast, and the ferry comes and we all start walking down to the ferry with them, and people are getting loaded on the ferry, saying goodbye, sitting around chatting, and then we notice like Doc isn't on the ferry, and the ferry starts leaving, and Merle is on the ferry, and I think their car is on the ferry, and Doc isn't there, and so and we see he's kind of, I don't know, he'd gone to the bathroom or was chatting with the waitress at the diner or something, and he's walking down, slowly, and he can't see obviously that the ferry is taking off, but we all run down to as the ferry's leaving, we all run down and we're yelling, Doc Watson, we gotta wait for Doc. And the ferry actually stopped, turned around, and came back for him. And nobody had ever heard of that happening ever. Like, you missed the ferry. It's not turning around. And I just thought, well, yeah, you would come back for Doc Watson.
Cool. Just a couple more of these to go now. This one from Laurie Lewis was just, a lovely thing, a lovely little moment that maybe hadn't come up in the conversation. And some of these stories are things that people maybe wouldn't have thought to tell otherwise. And there's a lovely little bit from Laurie coming now.
I did a recording session one time in Nashville that was interrupted by Doc coming in to do it. I mean, he had a little like half-hour session in the middle of our session at the same place. Kind of squeezed him in. It was because somebody was trying to do a Levi's commercial. And they thought this would be a great Levi's commercial, is to have Doc telling this story about how Rosalie saved all of Merle's Levi's. And after Merle died, she took them out of the trunk that they were in and made a quilt out of all the Levi's that she had saved. And just hearing him talk about that was so beautiful. I mean, the ad never went anywhere. It never got made or anything, but being able to hear him talk so freely and openly about a very big event in his life, and what's something that must have been pretty painful, but he just talks so lovingly. And then he's in this studio where they have every kind of mic. They've got all these fancy mics in there, and he comes in, he goes, "No, just give me a Shure SM58. I know what it's going to do. I like that. Give me that."
Cool. I've got two more things for you. One is just a story. I spoke to Jack Lawrence. I've included the entire interview with Jack in episode 1, so go and check that out. But he said, at the end, I said, "Is there anything you want to add?" He said, "No, not really. Just, one story." And this is that one story, and I love it. And I think you will too.
I own the D18, Martin D18 that Doc used on a bunch of the Vanguard records, On Stage, Home Again, and the Flat and Scruggs Strictly Instrumental. He gave me that guitar, I don't know, 35 years ago. And the way I got it is pretty funny. At Christmas every year, the weekend before Christmas, Doc and I would play at a place in Johnson City, Tennessee, called the Down Home, and it was like our Christmas party. There we'd go over and play 2 shows, turn the house, do 2 shows, and did it the week before Christmas for 25 years. And I would go pick up Doc, drive across the mountain, and we'd do the shows, and I'd come back, usually driving with one eye closed. We would come back, and I would stay the night with Doc and Rosalie. So on those occasions, I would I'd go out in the kitchen and grab a cup of coffee, and go down into Doc's music room. And I noticed in the corner behind his stereo cabinet this old beat up guitar. And so I pulled it out of the corner, and I recognized it as the guitar I'd grown up listening to on his records. And so I dusted, this bridge was coming off of it, and it had 3 strings, and there was a half an inch of dust on it. So, I pulled it out, and I dusted it off, and I was plucking on those 2 or 3 strings. And then I took a big sniff of the sound hole. I'm a sound hole sniffer from way back. I love the smell of, the interior of acoustic guitars. And so about the time I took that sniff in the sound hole, Doc was standing in the door, and he said, "What on earth are you doing?" And I told him, "So, well, there's this, I found this guitar in the corner, I think it can be repaired. I think you can fix this up. There's still some music left in this old thing." So he said, "Well, maybe one of these days I'll give it to you." Well, it didn't happen that time. So this repeats itself for, 3-4 years. Get up in the morning, get the coffee, go down and dust it, pluck the strings and sniff the sound hole. And Doc always said, "Well, one of these days I'll give it to you." So he finally did. He finally did one Christmas, and he said, "I just want the Grover Rotomatics tuning machines that are on there." And I said, "Well, give me your wrench and screwdriver. I'll take them off right away." So anyway, I got it home, and it was in worse shape than I imagined once I got a mirror inside. So anyway, it took me a couple of years piddling with it here and there to, doing all the repair work myself. Finally got it back together, and we were doing the Dear Old Southern Home and On Praying Ground records. We did both of those records in 5 days worth of sessions. Anyway, I got it back together, and I thought, this is going to be cool. I'm going to take this guitar. This guitar is going to be on a Doc Watson record again, only with me playing it. So anyway, we're setting up in the studio, and I didn't tell Doc I was bringing it. We're setting up in the studio, and I just laid it in his lap. And as soon as he grabbed the neck, he knew the guitar. Mm-hmm. And he strummed it and said, "Well, man, you were right. There is still some music left in this guitar. I can't believe it, that it's playable again." And he played on it for about 10 minutes and kept going on about what a good old friend that guitar had been to him, and how he just still loved the tone of that guitar and everything. And I could tell by the look on his face, he's thinking, "I should have fixed that thing. I should have fixed that guitar." And so he was strumming away, and I leaned over and whispered in his ear and said, "Yeah, maybe one of these days I'll give it to you."
That was Jack Lawrence. What a great story. And we're going to finish with Tim O'Brien. Just a final thought from Tim. Again, a quiet little reflective moment at the end of our interview, which is a nice little reflective moment to end these 2 episodes. I can't tell you what a joy they've been to put together, and I really hope you've enjoyed them, and I hope you don't mind how long they are, because they are fairly epic. But yeah, it's been a joy. I could have carried on doing this for months, but having today as a hard deadline to release them meant I couldn't, which is definitely a good thing. Here's a final thought from Tim O'Brien. I really hope you've enjoyed these episodes as much as I've enjoyed making them.
I don't have much to add except that he was this gracious, modest guy. As much of a hero as he was, I think he knew that, but he constantly shied away from it. And he knew that he was a significant guy. My last meeting with him, I actually called him up on the phone, and it was I had to sort of get my nerve up to sort of kind of invite myself to his house, because I was within striking distance. And number of times I passed by there, and he'd been friendly to me and things, but I hadn't seen him for a couple of years, and he wasn't on the circuit as much. He was not in as good a health. And I called him up and I said, I just want to see how you're doing. And he said, I don't know who you are. And his daughter was there. Nancy said, oh, you know him. He's that fiddle player from Merlefest. And he goes, oh, you're that fiddle player from Merlefest. And we both knew that wasn't enough information. But we talked for a little longer, and he started remembering, and he invited me up there. And he wanted to be a good mentor. The people that loved his music. He loved playing music, but he knew I was kind of looking up to him, and I just wanted a little one-on-one time with him. Never had it really, except for a few minutes here and there. And we sat, the two of us, no one else was there, for about 3 hours and played and talked. And I left there thinking I think he really enjoyed it. He liked being Doc Watson. In spite of his modesty, he knew he was something important, and he knew he was giving something back there. And that's what he wanted to do, I think. All the young pickers that he befriended, he really encouraged them. And I was lucky to be one of them. So that's about all I got to say without going to tears. I mean, really, when I think about him, he's such a really important figure in my world, for sure.